Chapter 1. How did he turn into a potato? Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Lu Ji turned into a potato. That was how it happened. Lu Ji had once been a normal college student who, after having been cruelly tortured by an advanced mathematics exam, wandered off campus in a daze, met with Truck-kun, and was whisked away to another world. When he first arrived in this other world, Lu Ji wasn't a potato. Then, he was a human, though a hapless one stranded in the wilderness. Normally, the transmigrated party would either be dropped off near a village or town, land in some monster's lair, or have been summoned as a hero. However, none of these scenarios applied to Lu Ji. He simply found himself in the middle of nowhere. At that moment, Lu Ji hadn't yet realized that he had fallen into another world. Though unclear about what had occurred, he started to follow the sound of water, planning to walk downstream along the stream, hoping to find a village or town. After all, humans tended to develop settlements near water sources. However, Lu Ji forgot one thing. Yes, humans like water sources, but so did animals. About half a day into his journey downstream, he encountered a bear, 4 to 5 meters tall, with a horn on its head. It was then that Lu Ji realized he had probably landed in another world. And if he wasn't careful, he was probably about to die again. Perhaps spurred by the looming threat of death, Lu Ji, who had never climbed a tree in his life, scrambled up to the top of a nearby tree like his ancient ancestors did and clung to the trunk, too afraid to move. Ironically, at the height he was at, the 4 to 5 meter tall bear only needed to stand up and could easily swat Lu Ji down with a paw. Fortunately, his luck held out. The giant bear, perhaps due to poor eyesight, did not notice him, or maybe just wasn't interested in a meal with legs. In any case, it didn't spot Lu Ji or seem to bother looking for him. Instead, it just sat by the side of the stream, pawing fish out of the water and eating them one after the other. Lu Ji dared not move. He hung onto the tree, watching that giant bear slap fish out of the water as easily as someone cracking sunflower seeds. He didn't know how there were so many fish in this tiny stream. All he knew was that he definitely wouldn't dare eat them. Each one looked as if it had been exposed to nuclear radiation, their scales shimmering with a strange glow. But the bear seemed to enjoy its meal, staying by the riverbank and eating all day long, which resulted in Lu Ji being stuck in the tree for the entire day. As dusk fell, the bear seemed finally full and leisurely left the stream bank. At that time, Lu Ji's limbs were nearly numb. Seeing that it was clear, he relaxed his grip and fell straight down. Fortunately, the ground below was covered with bushes, at least saving Lu Ji from some broken bones. Lu Ji was somewhat bewildered as he lay in the bushes. He didn't know whether to consider himself lucky or not. On one hand, it was unlucky because he had died, but he hadn't completely died and had transmigrated to another world. On the other hand, his location after crossing over could have been better as it seemed that he could die once more at any time. But at least, he was still alive for now, so it could be considered good luck. Having spent an entire day clinging to a tree for dear life, Lu Ji was really starting to feel quite hungry. He had been gripped by fear while hanging onto the tree, but now that he was on the ground, the sensation of hunger hit Lu Ji like a surging tsunami. Struggling slightly, Lu Ji got up from the bushes, brushed off the fallen leaves on his clothes, and scanned his surroundings, trying to find something to eat. His gaze first settled on that tiny stream. Although those fishes looked like they had been exposed to nuclear radiation. No, it was still unrealistic. He wasn't a bear, and trying to munch on raw freshwater fish was too much of a challenge. Moreover, he doubted if he could even catch any fish in the first place. Lu Ji's rational line of thought was to find some wild fruit to eat and quickly leave. With night approaching, he didn't dare stay near the stream, not knowing what kind of wild beast he might encounter next. In the end, Lu Ji did find some fruit, just that they had a faint glow, seemingly like those radiated fish, which made him rather hesitant to try consuming them. Just as he was getting frustrated, Lu Ji discovered some plants that looked a lot like potato shoots. He found a stick and tried digging around the plants, and indeed unearthed a few small potatoes. At that moment, Lu Ji naively thought that he might get to eat some roasted potatoes. Thus, he energetically dug around the area, unearthing a dozen or so potatoes of varying sizes. After washing his haul in the stream, he left the stream bank. Lu Ji ran to a more distant wooded area, found a dry spot, and prepared to make a fire to roast some potatoes and keep warm overnight. However, Lu Ji soon realized that he had underestimated the task. He became aware of it when he spent a long time trying to produce a spark by rubbing a stick against a piece of wood without any success. At that moment, Lu Ji realized that starting a fire with friction was a skillful task. Indeed, it seemed practically impossible for someone like him to ignite a piece of wood directly with a stick, unless he could move as fast as a flash. But clearly he wasn't. Therefore, after half an hour of futile efforts, the only results were nearly rubbing his hands raw. He also realized that there must be something wrong with his method, but the strong hunger pangs, unease, frustration from his failure to start a fire, and anxiety about the future were clouding his thoughts. He simply wasn't in a state to think clearly on how to successfully start a fire. So much so he even began considering trying to eat the potatoes raw. While raw potatoes can be toxic, isn't the toxicity rather low if they aren't green or sprouting? Staring at the potato in his hand, Lu Ji pondered for a long while. Eventually, whether due to extreme hunger or the surrealness of the day's experiences giving him some sort of courage, he did something bizarre. He actually bit into the raw potato, skin and all, even though all the dirt wasn't washed off properly. Not only did he bite in, but he also chewed and then swallowed. The taste of raw potato wasn't as strange as he expected. Rather, it was the earthy taste of the skin that was somewhat nauseating, but Lu Ji still swallowed it. He only realized what he had done after swallowing. At first, he was somewhat shocked, and then, he felt a surge of impulse within him. It was an inexplicable impulse, similar to the instinct of standing up or raising a hand, the sort of natural urge to perform some kind of action. Lu Ji went along with this instinct and did the action. And then, he became a potato. Or rather, a potato plant. A potato plant that had no hearing, no sight, no touch. A potato plant with verdant leaves with only some sense of awareness of its own physical state. Chapter 2. Photosynthesis is comfortable. Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. What was it like to become a potato plant? Well, it was very uncomfortable for Lu Ji, at least initially. It was a sensation close to suffocation, but not entirely. Lu Ji instinctively changed back, lying on the ground and gasping for air. He didn't know why he could turn into a potato, but the fact that it happened so irrationally was undeniable. There had been no system prompts or magical cheats appearing in his consciousness. However, Lu Ji almost instantly realized that this might be his own unique benefit from transmigrating. Just like how it was written in most web novels, a sort of universally accepted, requisite gift for those who crossed into another world. Although his first experience wasn't pleasant and even felt a bit ridiculous, Lu Ji quickly realized that this ability was exactly what he needed right now. After all, in the wilderness, a potato plant, while sounding rather unglamorous, would clearly have an easier time surviving than a human who needed food, water, shelter, and warmth and be mindful of injuries and infections. As for why Lu Ji felt suffocation when he first transformed, it was probably because his lower half wasn't buried in the soil. Of course, this was only his guess, but he reckoned it was worth a try. Lu Ji walked around, found a spot with good sunlight and soft soil, and planned to dig a hole to bury himself and test out this theory. Obviously, digging a pit half a man's height wasn't easy without a shovel, but luckily, Lu Ji wasn't that large when he became a potato. With a stick he found, it wasn't too difficult for him to dig a hole about 20 to 30 centimeters deep. After the hole was dug, Lu Ji stepped into it. He piled the excavated soil beside his feet so that when he transformed into a potato, the soil would cover his roots. Taking a deep breath, Lu Ji recalled the strange impulse within his body and went with it once again. Then, he once more transformed into a potato. To be honest, it felt rather bizarre to freely become a potato at any time. but even stranger was the sensation of becoming a potato plant with its roots enveloped by the soil. How could this feeling be described? Like snuggling into a warm blanket while enjoying comfort food but without actually eating anything, so nothing dirtied the blanket. The sensation was intriguing, completely devoid of the discomfort he felt the first time, and was even somewhat pleasant. At least it was much more pleasant than being hungry, sleepy, and in pain as a human being. Slowly stretching his leaves and roots, Lu Ji yawned in his imagination. And then, he fell asleep. Perhaps potatoes didn't need to sleep, but Lu Ji's consciousness needed rest to recuperate. As for what to do later, that was a thought for tomorrow. In a distant royal court, a complex astral map woven from arcane magic shone brightly. Hundreds of arcanists stood in formation, radiating with a slowly flowing multicolored glow. The elderly king stood beneath the astral map, quietly waiting. The horn of calamity had been sounded, and according to the oracle, a savior from another world was about to arrive. The astral map revolved slowly, and suddenly, a blurred image appeared in the space above, which gradually solidified and became clearer. The elderly king's eyes widened, and his breathing became even more rapid. He knew that it was arriving. The hero they summoned was about to appear. 10 seconds. It only took 10 seconds for the image to solidify, but to the king, these 10 seconds felt longer than a day. Eventually, the image solidified completely into a tangible form, and an empty wilderness appeared in front of everyone. The elderly king was stunned. He looked in astonishment at the head arcanist conducting the ritual, only to be met with a similar look of shock. Did it fail? The king asked, shakily. No, perhaps it is a position calibration error. Let's try again, said the aged arcanist, waving his staff to dissipate the image in the astral map. Half an hour again, they summoned another image. But what appeared, like before, was still the same empty wilderness devoid of even a soul. They dispelled the image and tried again, but the result was the same. Again and again they tried, but no matter how many times, the image that appeared within the astral map was the same empty wilderness with nary a change. The atmosphere in the entire royal court plummeted, and everyone's faces looked grim. They meticulously scanned every inch of the image, trying to discern if there was any trace of a being, but no matter how much they looked, they just couldn't make out any figure in the image. In their frantic search, no one noticed that in the very center of the image, behind the tall weeds, were the green leaves of a potato plant, gently swaying in the breeze. What was it like as a potato buried in the soil? Put it this way, it was kind of addictive. Mainly when fully engaged in photosynthesis, it was extremely pleasant. At night, when there was no sun, it was somewhat boring and felt not much different from sleeping. But when the sun came out in the day, the sensation of chlorophylls being activated and energy surging into the body could be described with one word: comfortable. It was so comfortable that a whole day passed by just like that while Lu Ji wasn't paying attention. Since there weren't visual or auditory senses while in the potato state, the perception of time was also very vague. It wasn't until the sun set and the comfortable sensation faded that Lu Ji realized it had become dark again. This was a bit awkward. Lu Ji originally turned into a potato with the plan of spending the night in the soil and then leaving during the day, but he lost track of time and it was evening again. I'll just wait another day before setting off, Lu Ji thought to himself. At least, that was what he thought for now. But then, when the sun came out the next day, Lu Ji unknowingly spent the entire day engaged in photosynthesis once more. It wasn't that he didn't wish to change back, but mainly, well, how should he put it? It was like sleeping in, being a potato, and without a phone, the line between 5 more minutes and 5 more hours of sleep was somewhat blurred, and he inadvertently ended up sleeping in for several more hours. Yes, inadvertently, definitely not because photosynthesis was too enjoyable and he forgot about everything else. Never mind, I won't die, so it doesn't matter if I stay another day, Lu Ji thought to himself as he contentedly stretched out his leaves and stem. On the third day, it rained. Rainy days weren't good for traveling, and the moisture from the rain was very comforting, so Lu Ji decided to stay in the soil for another day. On the fourth day, the weather was sunny, and the comfort during the day was even greater than previous days due to the recent rain. It would be a waste not to fully enjoy such good weather as a potato, so Lu Ji decided to stay in the soil for yet another day. On the fifth day, it was very pleasant, so he decided to stay one more day. On the sixth day, the moisture in the soil was just right, so he stayed another day. On the seventh day, there was a light rain. With rain and sunlight present, it was just too perfect. On the eighth day, Your Majesty, it has already been a month, the aged arcanist leaned forward to speak. The young ones are at their limits. Yes, I know, the elderly king replied slowly, reluctantly shifting his gaze away from the astral map. A month had passed, and no matter how many times they retried, the image displayed on the astral map was always the same patch of weed-infested wilderness, without any changes. Even if it was hard to accept, the king realized that it was time to declare the summoning ritual a failure. The king sighed and slowly walked toward his throne. He slumped down on it and remained silent for a long time. Then, he spoke, everyone, go rest. In a month, we'll have a new summoning ritual. But the treasury doesn't have enough money for a second summoning, the aged arcanist said with a distressed expression. Yes, I know, the elderly king said gravely, but it's just a matter of the treasury being empty, after all. It's time for my extravagant brothers and nephews to learn to live with some hardship. Chapter 3. Who says a hero must save the world? Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Today was roughly the 60th day since Lu Ji became a potato. Well, roughly. People could easily forget the date even with a calendar, much less after becoming a potato. As a potato, the perception of time was much blurrier. It might have been 60 days, perhaps slightly over 60 days, or even roughly 70 days. It wasn't that Lu Ji didn't want to leave, but rather, put it this way, being a potato was surprisingly comfortable. No need to eat, no need to drink, basking in the sunlight, engaging in photosynthesis, and the day just passed by. In his previous life, Lu Ji spent 3 years in high school losing his hair from stress, then having to get a driver's license after graduating. He thought college would be easier, only to find out that he had been deceived for a whole 18 years. College wasn't easy at all. Just advanced mathematics and English were enough to leave him concussed, and that wasn't even mentioning the tons of major-specific modules. All he experienced in that half a lifetime was exhaustion. And when chatting with various alumni and hearing them complain about the hardships of their work lives, Lu Ji felt utterly weary. It seemed like a person's life had to be spent in constant busy hustle, never stopping to rest. Compared to that, being a wild potato might perhaps be a little more relaxing. No danger, no stress, nothing to do, not having to think, no worries, no need to strive. He could just comfortably soak up the sun and watch as the days went by. Sometimes, Lu Ji even thought about being a potato for a lifetime. Well, that wouldn't really work. A human's life was much more exciting, after all. But if it was just a little extended vacation, Lu Ji didn't mind lazing about for another month or two. In the royal court, the elderly king watched the slowly revolving astral map, awaiting the oracle's revelation. After the failure of the previous summoning ritual, he had spent a month and, at the cost of several nobles' heads, finally gathered the resources needed for the second summoning. Now, the summoning was complete, and the mists of fate were parting to reveal the location of the summoned one. The king waited quietly. A minute, 10 minutes, an hour, several hours. This time, the changes in the astral map were exceptionally slow, taking a full day and night before the image finally began to emerge. However, upon seeing the scene in the image, the drowsy king's eyes suddenly opened wide. The location shown in the image was none other than within the royal court, right beneath the astral map. There, a strapping man stood proudly on the spot. This man, clad in a scarlet cloak and lightweight armor, carrying a long sword and shield, had short brown hair, a righteous face, and a determined look. If there ever was a template for the image of a hero, it was definitely him. The king lowered his head and cast his gaze toward the center of the array, and sure enough, just like in the astral map, there stood the strapping and heroic-looking man. Have you all been searching for me all this time? The man asked, his voice deep and resonant. Yes, yes, the elderly king stood up excitedly. Hero from another world, it is us who have summoned you. Please save this world and save its people. It's like this again. I understand. The man nodded. Ah, again? The elderly king was slightly perplexed. Yes, again. The man in the scarlet cloak smiled, his righteous face beaming like sunlight. You aren't the first to summon me. You're right, I am a hero from another world. Before this, I've already saved 3 worlds on the brink of destruction. Then, you will save our world too, right? There was clear excitement in the elderly king's voice. He suddenly felt that draining the entire kingdom's resources for the second summoning wasn't that bad after all, since they were able to summon a hero with such legendary experience. Save your world? Of course, I'm a hero. It's my destiny to save worlds, chuckled the self-proclaimed hero as he placed particular emphasis on the word, your. Then, he walked toward the elderly king and reached out his hands, cupping the king's cheeks. Why you, what are you doing? The elderly king, still reveling in ecstasy, was taken aback by the hero's sudden action. Shouldn't this kind of gesture be meant for a princess? Why is he doing this to me? Could this hero actually have this sort of inclination? Am I, for the sake of the world, to sacrifice my chastity? As the king's mind raced with wild thoughts, the hero spoke. What a beautiful crown, said the hero, his beaming smile glowing like the sun as he cradled the sides of the king's head, his middle fingers gently supporting the crown. Gorgeous rubies, intricate engravings, finely carved patterns, a masterpiece. Why your hands are a bit forceful. Could you let go of me? The elderly king could feel the man's hands pressing harder, squeezing his head tighter and tighter. However, the hero didn't heed the king. Stop, you might be a hero, but you can't disrespect the king. A royal knight clad in gold armor couldn't tolerate it and bellowed at the man. Similarly, the hero ignored him. Instead, he continued to gaze at the crown as if entranced by it, muttering stuff like, beautiful, and, so lovely, while his hands cradled the king's head, continuously lifting it upward. No, please stop, it hurts, ow, the king's head was yanked upward, and he was lifted off his feet, forced to tiptoe as he struggled. Bastard, I told you to stop, the knight in golden armor roared and threw a punch at the man. An overwhelming pressure encapsulated the strike as a golden aura appeared at the tip of the fist, as if symbolizing the royal knight's golden crest shining brilliantly. Evidently, this top-tier royal knight of the kingdom was truly angry, and his strike was like a fierce thunder. Finally, the hero looked at him. It was just a glance, and then, his right foot kicked out at the knight with a speed almost invisible to the naked eye. In the next instant, the knight's upper body exploded into a spray of blood, his organs and fragments of his metal armor splattering against a wall. With a clang, the knight's lower body fell to the ground, leaving a trail of blood and intestines. Arg, no, Rugains, the king's eyes were wide in horror seeing the knight's remains. He could hear his own skull cracking, bit by bit, like a countdown timer to the end of his life. Boom. A massive flame appeared out of nowhere, blasting toward the man's back. The archmage stood solemn as if facing a great threat. Following closely, all the arcanists beneath the throne also attacked as countless arcane missiles and magical attacks converged on the hero. However, these formidable magical attacks, upon coming into contact with the man's scarlet cloak, were seemingly absorbed entirely into a dark abyss, causing no harm to the man. The only effect they had was to make the cloak shine a brighter shade of red and became increasingly dazzling. And then, it seemed to reach a critical point. The cloak emitted a blinding line, like a solar flare. An intense heat swept across the entire royal court, charring hundreds of arcanists into ash before they could even scream. The life-preserving shield conjured by the head arcanist melted rapidly like lard in a hot pan, leaving the kingdom's strongest spellcaster to only watch on in despair as magical energies far beyond his comprehension claimed his life. The man who called himself a hero didn't even glance back at them. He was intently pushing the crown with his middle fingers, slowly sliding it off the king's head. Creak, crack. The king felt his ear bones being crushed into fragments. His eyeballs bulged as if they were about to pop out of their sockets. Creak, crack. The world turned blood red for the king. The immense pain made him want to scream, but his shattered jawbone only allowed him to emit a mosquito-like whimper. Creak, crack, KK. Bang. Brain matter and blood splattered everywhere. The headless body collapsed abruptly, and the red gemstones of the blood-soaked crown seemed to bedazzle even more. Blood and filth flowed down the hands of the hero, who seemed utterly unconcerned. Casually, he twirled the crown and placed it on his own head. Then, he kicked aside the king's corpse, flipped his cloak, and sat down on the blood-stained throne. Now, this is our world. As he said that, he took out a blood-covered heart from his pocket, flung it to the ground, and crushed it underfoot into a pulp. Meanwhile, somewhere in the world, several vultures were picking at a corpse. It was a body wearing a high school uniform. His eyes were wide open, limbs stiff, and his face was etched with terror. And at his chest was a large gaping hole. Chapter 4. Buried in the ground, covered in soil. Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Lu Ji no longer knew how long he had been a potato for. Years. No, it couldn't be that short. Perhaps several decades? Possibly several centuries or a millennium? I don't know. In any case, this extended vacation had lasted far longer than he had imagined. A long time ago, he had tried countless times to revert to human form and search for villages or towns, but each attempt ended in failure, leaving him starving and utterly exhausted. He even suspected that there were no human settlements nearby at all as he couldn't find any trace of human activity. There were no footprints, no human voices. He didn't see signs of smoke or any roads. Eventually, he could only give up. After all, Lu Ji was just an ordinary college student who had spent his entire life studying. He knew practically nothing about surviving in the wild. Actually, he felt somewhat regrettable that he hadn't watched some survival show episodes before, but now, it was too late for all that. With no knowledge of wilderness survival, not knowing where he was, and being in another world, Lu Ji doubted that common navigational wisdom would be of any use. Most importantly, he didn't know how to find edible food, nor did he know whether the foods he might find in this strange other world were safe to eat. Unable to find food, he was forced to frequently turn into a potato, relying on photosynthesis to energize his body. Over time, he simply gave up being human. And so, he contentedly remained a potato. Was it boring? A little at the beginning. But after being a potato for a long time, Lu Ji's mentality and perception of time also changed. He didn't want to move, and he didn't want to do anything. There was no pressure and no motivation. Once Lu Ji accepted the fact that he was a potato, everything started to seem natural. As a potato, not being dug up and eaten was considered a success. As for other desires, well, perhaps praying that the next day brought about good weather. When the weather was good, photosynthesis was a really comfortable process. And perhaps because he was in another world and continuously drawing nutrients from the earth, Lu Ji felt a certain power of the earth accumulating inside him. The process was slow, but given the long time Lu Ji had been a potato, after so many years passed, he felt that the energy accumulated inside him had reached some kind of... Well, he also didn't know what sort of level to put it. Moreover, he wasn't sure if this somewhat fantastical feeling was real or if it was just an illusion caused by the swelling of his tuber. In his earlier years, he had reverted to human form but didn't notice much change in his body. But thinking back, if he had been growing for so many years as a potato... How much might he have grown? Deep within an ancient forest untouched for millennia, a towering tree stood majestically. A humanoid tiger with white brows and dressed in light leather armor was perched atop the tree. After scanning the surroundings, he gently leapt down. Beneath the tree stood two people, a petite girl in a tattered robe and a young man in black coarse cloth with a long sword slung at his waist. The environment in the vicinity seems good. I didn't find any traces of activity from any races, nor did I smell any powerful magical beasts, the Tiger Man said while brushing the leaves off himself. If we find a water source, I reckon we can start building our new home. Beasts don't worry me, but I'm afraid it won't be long before the Empire's claws reach this area. The young swordsman shook his head slightly. Building a temporary refuge is fine, but let's not get our hopes too high for a new home. No way, the Tiger Man scratched his head. We've already crossed the desert of burials. Those bastards wouldn't come running over no matter how dogged they might be, right? We've crossed the desert of burials, but do you think those monsters can't cross it? The young swordsman shrugged. They can cross, but they have no reason to come here. The Tiger Man spread his hands. According to those underground fellows, there aren't any civilized settlements here. They surely won't come all this way just to clear land and cultivate crops, Who knows? Before their own underground city was blown up, the dwarves also assumed that they could predict the tyrant's way of thinking, sighed the young swordsman. And what happened then? They just kept waiting for the tyrant to come to negotiate until their entire race was buried underground. What do you think that bastard was after by burying these dwarves and their several millennia of wealth and creation? The Tiger Man was at a momentary loss for words. Then, after a pause, he suggested, perhaps a certain dwarf offended him. That would be just great. My guess is that people from the Tigerman and Dragonblood races have offended him too, said the young swordsman with a grimace. Sounds like we're doomed sooner or later. You're still as eloquent as ever. The Tiger Man sighed and turned to the petite girl who had been silent. Yane, what do you think? I've been thinking about something, said the petite girl named Yane as she stepped forward and pointed her staff towards something behind the two men. Say, what do you think that thing actually is? What thing? The Tiger Man turned around to look and turned back in puzzlement. Is there something strange behind us? Right there. Yane pointed to the front again. The young swordsman followed Yane's direction and asked doubtfully, are you pointing at that huge 3-meter tall bush? That's not a bush. I don't know how to describe it, but I think. Yane scratched her cheek. I think it's like a potato plant enlarged many times over. Lu Ji felt strange. He felt as if he had lost something, yet at the same time, felt like he hadn't lost anything at all. In so many years that had passed, this was the first time he had this sensation. It was like someone cutting his hair, or rather, felt like someone trimming his nails. The sensation was neither painful nor itchy, and it was only momentarily, so he didn't think much of it. However, the problem was that this sensation kept recurring ever so often, occurring about 5 or 6 times in a very short period. This feeling was somewhat subtle, similar to nail trimming in its lack of pain or itchiness, but it felt as though, if left unchecked, perhaps one day it might cut right down to the flesh of his fingers. Could I be sick? Lu Ji couldn't help but wonder. While he didn't know much about agriculture, he instinctively felt that perhaps he was affected by some pest or disease. Maybe a certain insect was nibbling on his leaves? Speaking of which, it had been a very long time since he had transformed back into a human. Perhaps, it was time for him to revert back to human form and get some fresh air. Chapter 5. How many years had it been since he last saw a living person? Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. I never imagined that this would really be a potato, mumbled a large Tiger Man sitting by the fire, munching on a roasted potato. It's like a whole new world on the other side of the desert of burials. To think there are actually such strange things here. Next to him was a half-person deep pit. The young swordsman stood inside it, examining a small piece of root in his hands. Several potatoes of different sizes were piled beside him, freshly dug from the earth judging by the dirt on them. You two are eating already? Yane approached. Seeing the Tiger Man's actions, she frowned. Although it looks like a potato and even smells like one when roasted, but it tastes like a potato too, so it must be a potato. The Tiger Man waved his hand dismissively. Yane, you're being too cautious. Even though we're beyond the desert, surely we don't need to be afraid of a potato, right? Fine. I hope you don't end up poisoned and dying. Yane crossed her arms in disbelief. Otherwise, we'll be short of one laborer for building the house. Have we decided to build a house here? The Tiger Man looked surprised. Yes, I've surveyed the area nearby, and we can build a temporary dwelling. The others, The young swordsman gazed into the distance and sighed. Hey, brother, don't sigh. The Tiger Man slapped him on the backside. Calidora is the strongest among the holy dragons of your race. They'll be fine. You're right. The young swordsman nodded. I ought to believe in her, and that's all I can do. If something were to happen to her, I really don't know what I'd do. Suddenly, during their conversation, the young swordsman felt the ground beneath him start to tremble, and the pit was caving in. What's happening? An earthquake? He was startled and quickly jumped out of the pit, only to find that the nearby ground was all sinking, and something seemed to be moving in the soil. Hey, what the hell is this? The Tiger Man also jumped in shock. He had been sitting on the ground eating a potato, and this sudden change caused him to sink into the soil, with the fire from the campfire tilting toward his crotch because of the collapsing ground. His straw trousers immediately began to emit a burning smell, causing him to panic as he frantically dealt with the fire crisis at his crotch. Beside him, Yane floated in the air, observing the scene and murmuring to herself, damn, I told you not to eat stuff randomly. What the heck is this? What the heck is this? Help me, quick, I'm about to catch fire. The Tiger Man screamed, struggling with the burning twigs at his crotch. In the next moment, a large blob of liquid appeared out of thin air and splashed directly onto his crotch. Next, a bunch of soil floated up, supporting his armpits and lifting into the air like someone picking up a cat. The Tiger Man glanced at his soaked crotch, about to say something, but was stunned by the scene unfolding before him. In front of him, the ground within a radius of several hundred meters was collapsing, and in the center of the collapse, the 3-meter-tall potato plant was shrinking. Is this caused by that potato plant? What is it, magic, or is there something underground? The Tiger Man rambled in bewilderment. Given the scale of activity, if there really was something hidden underground. The Tiger Man gulped. No, that's not it. The young swordsman suddenly spoke up. His eyes gleamed brightly, and his golden dragon-like pupils scanned the ground. It's just this thing. It's shrinking. My God, how vast must its root system be? Shrinking? What do you mean shrinking? Are you saying that the potato's root system is shrinking? The Tiger Man exclaimed in astonishment. How is that possible? Plant fibers aren't like tentacles. They don't have that sort of elasticity. How would I know? But it's just shrinking. The young swordsman said as a nearby tree suddenly fell down, forcing him to dodge. Yane waved her staff, and another heap of soil floated up, lifting the young swordsman into the air as well. By now, it wasn't only that one tree that had fallen. Many other nearby trees began to tilt and collapse due to the significant subsidence of the land, creating a terrifyingly large pit spanning several hundred meters. At the center of the pit, the once over 3-meter-tall plant had shrunk by more than half, and the rate of shrinkage was still accelerating. Vaguely, it even began to take on a somewhat human shape. This, has the potato become a spirit? A potato person? The Tiger Man wondered aloud. Or is that a race that can turn into plants? Wood elves? I've never heard of wood elves that turn into potatoes. Yane frowned. Stop your wild guesses. This is the other side of the desert, and nobody knows what might be here. Be prepared, but don't act rashly, and do not attack first. Yeah, even though you say that, hanging up here really saps my strength, the Tiger Man said as his body dangled limply, his face full of resignation. While he was a large humanoid cat, he was still fundamentally a big cat. The young swordsman beside him remained silent, his left hand resting on his sword sheath. The three of them watched warily as the potato plant continued to shrink from 3 meters to 2 meters, and finally to less than 1 meter. The green leaves gradually disappeared, revealing healthy, beige-colored skin. The three could see clearly now that it was a person. A person, half buried in the soil. This completely unclothed individual had the face of an ordinary human, a sturdy body, and long, flowing, emerald green hair. Yes, emerald green hair. So vibrant it seemed as if it contained chlorophyll. Hey, Yane, have you ever heard of a race with green hair? The Tiger Man asked quietly. I remember even wood elves only have green leaves growing on their hair, not the hair itself being green, right? That's why I've been repeating myself so many times. This other side of the desert is a whole new world. Yang rolled her eyes at him. For all we know, this could just be what the natives here look like. Shush, do you think he understands our common language? The tiger man asked hesitantly. Yang ignored him. She didn't bother to answer a question that seemed to only have, I don't know, as a response. As the trio watched tensely, the strange person opened his eyes. Then he shrieked, quickly covered his eyes again, and shouted loudly, what the hell? It's so bright. He spoke clearly, but the trio couldn't understand. Ha, I guess you got your answer. Yang shrugged. Perhaps he speaks multiple languages? The tiger man still wasn't letting up. While the two were talking, the strange man with green hair, still shielding his eyes from the glaring sun, slowly managed to open his eyes. He first looked down at himself, then around at his surroundings, and finally, his gaze landed on the three floating people above him. And then, his mouth opened wide. The trio were immediately startled, thinking that he was about to unleash some devastating magical attack from his mouth, and instinctively assumed defensive stances. Of course, the attack they anticipated didn't come. Instead, they saw the strange man's mouth tremble, and two crystal clear droplets rolled down from his eyes. Chapter 6. Awesome, let me give you applause. Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Lu Ji had no idea how long it had been since he had last seen another living person. Though his days as a potato were leisurely and comfortable, they were equally lonely. Even though he could endure a long potato life, deep down, he still hoped that one day he would encounter other people. After all, he was fundamentally a human being. Just that so much time had passed that he had already given up hope. Yet, unexpectedly, he had indeed encountered other people upon reverting back, 3 of them, no less. How could he contain his excitement? Unfortunately, it seemed that there was a language barrier. He couldn't understand what they were saying, and they couldn't understand him either. He tried speaking Mandarin, English, some Japanese, Korean, and Thai lingo he knew, but the 3 others still looked confused. The petite girl on their side also seemed to switch between several languages trying to communicate with him, but to no avail. This was rather frustrating. What happened to the universal translator that usually comes with transmigration? Why did it just fail for him? After a series of futile gesticulations and attempts at communication, the trio moved aside to whisper among themselves. Lu Ji craned his neck, watching them, hoping they wouldn't just leave him here and go away. He had seen it. They were flying just moments ago. As for whether they would be a threat to him, Lu Ji glanced down at his bare body. Well, he was utterly penniless with nothing on him. As for his innocence, that would just be absurd. Lu Ji took a good look at the 3 of them. They shouldn't be that sort of perverts. In any case, as a bare and broke individual, his personal safety was probably not a concern. Just that he was bare. Lu Ji looked down and dug around a bit. His little brother was in the soil, and his little brother was also bare. Looking up at the 3 in the distance, Lu Ji felt a little overwhelmed. This was awkward. It would be fine if they were all men, but that was a girl there. And considering the girl's height, whether she was an adult was questionable. Lu Ji couldn't just run out naked, right? The young man next to her had a sword. Lu Ji definitely didn't want to be mistaken for a pervert and get cut in half. Lu Ji mulled for a bit, then waved and shouted at the trio to catch their attention. He then pointed at himself, made the motion of putting his arms through the sleeves of a jacket, and mimed buttoning up, looking at them expectantly. The 3 exchanged looks, muttering among themselves. For some reason, the tiger man confidently slapped his chest, then strutted over with his chest puffed out. Lu Ji thought he was going to give him his coat, and hope sparkled in his eyes as he looked at the fur coat. However, the tiger man didn't take off his coat. Instead, he patted Lu Ji on the shoulder, squeezed his arm, and even poked his chest muscles, then gave him a thumbs up and nodded emphatically. Lu Ji. Lu Ji pondered for a moment, then mimed pulling a t-shirt over his head and pulling it down. The tiger man watched while stroking his chin. Then, he went around to check on Lu Ji's back, patted his abs, and once again gave Lu Ji a thumbs while beaming radiantly. Lu Ji. Lu Ji was bewildered and a bit anxious. Clenching his fist, he repeatedly mimed the motion of pulling on a coat, all while casting hopeful looks at the tiger man. And then, the tiger man faced him, made a pose as if showing off his pecs and gave him a brilliant smile that seemed to even glimmer. Lu Ji stared at him in bafflement and was utterly speechless for a long time. Seeing him stunned, the tiger man smiled radiantly again, then contentedly turned and walked away. No wonder that lad was showing off. His muscles really are impressive, the tiger man said as he walked back to his companions. They might not look exaggerated, but they are solid and springy, and I can tell they are powerful. But, do you really think he was showing off his muscles? It didn't look that way to me at all, said the young swordsman, the corner of his lips twitching. Huh? How could it not be? The tiger man asserted confidently. Didn't you see him first show off his arm muscles and pecs, then his back and abs, and finally he emphasized his chest muscles? If that's not showing off muscles, what is? While I don't know what his gestures meant, I know that confusion was written all over his face, muttered the young swordsman helplessly. I think he either had a request or wanted to tell us something. Really? The tiger man scratched his head, turning to Yang, who was deep in thought. Yang, what do you think? What? Yang looked up. What were you guys talking about? We were discussing what the gestures of that strange potato man meant, the young swordsman explained. What were you so absorbed in? Nothing. I was just trying to recall if there's any language that sounds close to his vocalizations. Yang shook her head slightly, then turned to the tiger man. Osar, what exactly were his gestures? Oh, like this, and this. The tiger man, named Osar, enthusiastically reenacted Lu Ji's movements. Of course, after his embellishments, the gestures indeed looked purely like flexing muscles. Oh, I see. Yang nodded, waved her staff, and conjured a small portal. She reached in and pulled out a coarse cloth robe, then casually handed it to Osar. Here, go give this to him. Osar took the robe, blinked, and looked back at the bare Lu Ji, puzzled. Wasn't he intentionally showing off his muscles? Why are you giving this to me? Unfortunately, you might be the only one interested in that. The young swordsman couldn't stand it anymore. He grabbed the robe and walked toward Lu Ji. Seeing that someone finally understood his intentions, Lu Ji burst into a relieved smile. Once he got the robe, he quickly slipped it over his body and finally pulled himself out of the ground. Feeling the solid earth beneath his feet for the first time in a long while was a strangely refreshing sensation for Lu Ji. Looks like he had really been a potato for far too long. Watching Lu Ji put on clothes and walk around with a look of novelty, the young swordsman stroked his chin and muttered to himself, what a strange fellow. Of course, Lu Ji couldn't understand what he was saying, so he just smiled at him. The young swordsman, taken aback for a moment, smiled back. Then he turned to leave. Lu Ji considered for a moment, then followed behind him. The young swordsman glanced at Lu Ji but didn't say anything, allowing the latter to follow behind. As they walked, Lu Ji observed the surroundings. He felt that he might really have lived as a potato for far too long. He remembered that the area used to be flat, but now there was a huge pit. Unfortunately, he hadn't kept track of time, and no one knew exactly when he had transmigrated to this world, so even if he wanted to figure out how long he had spent as a potato, there was no way for him to do so. And he just noticed that his hair seemed to have turned green. While it made sense for his hair to turn green after so many years of photosynthesis, it still felt a bit odd. While he was lost in his thoughts, a delicate and small face suddenly appeared in front of Lu Ji. It was the staff-wielding girl in a tattered robe, who had walked up and was looking straight at him. Just as he was feeling puzzled, Yang raised her right hand and snapped her fingers. Snap. A small bird made of flames appeared on Yang's fingertip. The little bird tilted its head, chirped crisply, then fluttered its wings, circling around them rapidly twice, and finally hovered in front of Lu Ji. Lu Ji stared at the flaming bird, and the bird watched him. Then suddenly, there was a pop, and the little bird exploded into a beautiful display of sparks and gradually faded away. Lu Ji stared blankly at the spot where the sparks had dissipated, then looked at Yang who was staring intently at him, seemingly awaiting his reaction. After a second of thought, Lu Ji raised both hands and offered enthusiastic applause for the performance. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 7, Cause Trouble. Since Lu Ji had turned back into human, naturally, potatoes were off the menu. To obtain sufficient food, the young swordsman decided to venture into the forest to hunt. Osar wanted to tag along, but the young swordsman didn't feel at ease leaving Yang alone with Lu Ji, and thus, the tiger man was forcibly made to stay. Now, Osar was idly sitting by a newly lit fire, while Yang was focused on writing and sketching in a small notebook nearby. Not far from them, Lu Ji was slowly flipping through a thick, heavy old tome. If I remember, that spellbook was the first gift from your teacher, right? Osar asked Yang while tossing a branch into the fire, and you just lend it to him like that? We know nothing about this world, and I think we need a guide, Yang replied without even looking up. That spellbook, though it's just a children's primer on magic, can teach simple incantations that I can use to communicate with him. But that was from your teacher. Osar started but stopped when he saw Yang glaring at him. He scratched his chin and changed the subject. Okay, never mind. But I thought using incantations to speak was just a trick pretentious third-rate mages use. That's usually true. Yang gaze went back to her notebook. But isn't the ability to be pretentious based on the fact that this thing can actually be used for communication? Then, why don't we teach him a common language or something? Osar asked. I have never learned how to teach someone a new language when there's no common language between us, Yang said. Besides, you may want to teach him, but he might not want to learn. But can he really learn incantations? Osar stroked his chin. I looked at spellbooks when I was a kid, and I couldn't understand a thing. It depends on luck. If someone is talented and has an interest, they can learn incantations on their own much faster than a new language. At least, judging from his reaction, he doesn't lack interest, Yang explained, tearing a page from her notebook and handing it to Osar. Here, your task. Try to get it done before the sun sets. Osar looked at the page and his mouth twitched wildly. This much timber, and I have to go so far to collect them? But Mervyn asked me to watch over you. Come on, do I look like I need guarding? Yang rolled her eyes. Mervyn has just been overly suspicious. I'm half Ifrit. I know far better than you whether that potato man is dangerous or not. Is he dangerous? Osar asked. Not at all. He's as safe as can be, Yang replied. I suspect he has never killed a person in his life. No, maybe he's never even seen someone die in front of him. No way. Osar glanced at Lu Ji in astonishment, then came to a realization. Oh, right, this is the other side of the desert. Right, this is the other side of the desert, Yang said solemnly. There is no tyrant and his dogs here, nor anyone's homeland turned into rubble. Osar opened his mouth to say something, then scratched his head, unsure of what to say. In the end, he muttered, I'm off to chop wood, before he turned and left. Yang sighed and lowered her head, continuing to write away in her little notebook. Lu Ji was somewhat in shock. Just now, it seemed like that underage girl had shown him a bit of magic. While he had already been in this world for many years, this was the first time he had seen magic. Well, if counting the time when he saw them flying right after he opened his eyes, then that would be the second. He wasn't sure how he had reacted at that moment, but Lu Ji felt it might be similar to the expression he had as a child when he first saw a Game Boy Advance. After all, that was magic. Lu Ji had grown up watching Harry Potter and had even fantasized about receiving his own Hogwarts acceptance letter delivered by an owl in his childhood. And then, that girl had given him a book. Initially, he found it strange. How could he understand a book when they didn't share a common language? But when he opened it, guess what? Turns out that it was a children's picture book. And it was an interactive one at that. Just by lightly touching the words in the pictures, a corresponding pronunciation would sound in his mind, like a magical version of a leapfrog learning book. Lu Ji wasn't sure if the pronunciation was too awkward, or if he had just been a potato for too long and had forgotten how to speak, but he struggled to mimic the simple three-syllable word associated with a small flame drawn on the first page. He felt like he was twisting his tongue in every way imaginable but couldn't get it right. The strangest part was, according to the instructions in the book, while saying the word, he was supposed to raise his right hand and point his index finger toward the sky. So there he was, right hand raised, left hand pressing the word in the book, repeating the clumsy pronunciation. As if he was a priest holding up a cross and reading from the Bible. Well, more like a priest using a reading book. Lu Ji couldn't help chuckling at the imagery in his mind of a priest holding a cross and touching the Bible as it triggered electronic voices. Nearby, Yang shot him a strange glance. Slightly embarrassed, Lu Ji touched his nose awkwardly. During his years as a potato, he had relied entirely on his wild imagination for entertainment, and he had slipped back into his old habit without realizing it. To cover his embarrassment, he quickly returned his gaze to the book, and out of habit, repeated the word from the book. This time, his unruly tongue suddenly cooperated, and he pronounced the syllables correctly. However, he had forgotten his right index finger wasn't pointing at the sky, but at his own head because he had just been touching his nose. The moment the word was spoken, Lu Ji felt a certain energy within him being activated, seemingly about to burst forth from his fingertip. He knew he could suppress this energy, but it happened so suddenly that he didn't have any time to react before the energy erupted. In the next moment, a brilliant flame filled Lu Ji's entire field of vision, and intense heat hit him face on. But just a moment later, a large ball of water splashed down on his head, cooling him down both inside and out. He spat out a mouthful of water and, when he looked up, saw Yang pointing her staff at him, with shock written all over her face. Lu Ji looked at her, then at the water all over him, and then at his fingertip, and suddenly realized what had just happened. Had he just cast magic? And had he then directed it at his own head when he used it? He now understood why the instructions had told him to point his hand toward the sky while speaking. He had followed the instructions, just that he had been distracted for a moment. And then, the water came down on his head. Lu Ji looked at Yang. By now, she had put away her staff and came over to squat in front of him. She poked his cheek, then pulled his eyelid up to look inside, and made an "ah" sound. Lu Ji hesitated, then opened his mouth wide and said, "Ah." Yang seemed to conjure a small wooden stick out of nowhere, using it to press down on Lu Ji's tongue and peered inside, then finally breathed a sigh of relief. Lu Ji pinched his throat. This procedure reminded him of visits to the doctor for tonsillitis as a child. Just as Lu Ji was thinking about how to thank her, Yang reached over and took the thick children's spellbook from his lap. It was then that Lu Ji realized that the book had probably suffered from the dousing of cold water. Yang gently flipped through the now thoroughly soaked spellbook, looking somewhat sorrowful. Sorry, Lu Ji said, then remembered that Yang probably wouldn't understand him. However, she smiled at him and responded with a short one-syllable word. Somehow, Lu Ji felt that it probably meant, it's okay. But despite saying so, the pain and sadness in Yang's eyes as she gazed at the book were unmistakable. Lu Ji realized that the book might have special significance for the young woman before him. As he watched Yang walk away with the book, Lu Ji gulped hard, feeling a bitterness in his throat. It seems that I've caused trouble, even though she lent me the book specifically so I could learn magic. Lu Ji couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Chapter 8, Can't Understand and Can't Ask Either. Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Yang placed the spellbook on a stone well lit by sunlight. Then, she summoned a plump little green bird. The little bird hopped to the edge of the spellbook and flapped its tiny wings, creating gentle breezes onto the spellbook. Really, teacher, is this your way of reminding me? Yang muttered as she gazed at the book, that magic shouldn't be half-heartedly taught, and every student should be given utmost care, or something like that. But then again, she glanced at Lu Ji who was wringing out his clothes nearby. The incantation he recited just now was merely a basic fire release magic. For a beginner, just creating sparks on his fingertip would already be impressive. Genius, or perhaps, racial talent. Right, he's a person that can transform into a potato. Yang turned back, continuing to mumble to the spellbook. So, teacher, are you trying to tell me that perhaps I should take teaching him a bit more seriously? Just like how you taught me? A breeze blew over the spellbook, making it flip to a new page. Yang shut her eyes, took a deep breath, and mustered a slight smile. Very well, it will give me something to do, Yang muttered softly. If not, I'm really afraid I might end up wanting to find you right now. Yang turned around, casually opening a spatial portal which she pulled a dry linen robe out from, and approached Lu Ji, who was drying his clothes by the fire. Lu Ji was still feeling guilty. When he saw Yang approach with a fresh robe, he felt too embarrassed to accept it and gestured that he could just dry his clothes. Yang ignored his refusal and pushed the new robe into Lu Ji's hands. Lu Ji tried to refuse again. He pushed the robes back and waved his hands repeatedly. To his surprise, Yang's hand went to the current robe Lu Ji was wearing as if she intended to remove it. This startled Lu Ji since he was only wearing that robe with nothing underneath. If she managed to lift it, everything would be exposed. Quickly pressing down on his robe, he took the new one and darted behind a nearby tree to change. Watching his awkward retreat, Yang's lips curled into a slight smile. He really is peculiar, she mused to herself. According to reports, the wilderness on this side has wild men, though they are all low-intelligence demi-human races. There shouldn't be anyone like him. No matter how she looked at it, Lu Ji didn't seem to match the information provided. Could the information reports be wrong, or did this man have some unknown origin? It was rather intriguing, but Yang wasn't interested in dwelling on it. Whatever his origin, race, or background, none of it mattered to her. After a short while, Lu Ji finished changing and came out from behind the tree holding his wet clothes behind him. Lu Ji might have changed his clothes, but his hair was still wet. To avoid soaking the fresh robe, he had to gather his hair into a bundle, bending forward to hold it in front of him in a rather comical fashion. Seeing a smiling Yang watching him, Lu Ji returned an awkward smile. As he walked over to the fire, intending to dry his lush green hair, he thought to himself that he should find a way to cut his hair short sometime. As soon as he sat down, Yang approached from behind and gently lifted his hair. Lu Ji wondered what she was doing until he felt a warm breeze at his back. It seemed that Yang was using magic to blow dry his hair. This made Lu Ji feel both flattered and slightly embarrassed. He wanted to tell her it wasn't necessary, but Yang began speaking before he could say anything. You know, when I first started learning fire magic, I accidentally set my own hair on fire. Just like you, I was doused by a ball of water and became soaking wet. Lu Ji didn't understand a single word, but he sensed it was best to remain quiet. So, he sat up straight and listened to Yang's story while enjoying the gentle breeze. Back then, my teacher used a soft breeze just like this to dry my hair. It was warm and soothing. Back then, I thought to myself, if only I could be as skilled as my teacher one day. That way, I could blow dry my own hair every day. Oh well, thinking back, I guess I did manage that. But, it's not enough, not nearly enough. Yang sniffled and felt tears forming at the corners of her eyes. Quickly, she rubbed them away with her hand. Even though he was facing forward, Lu Ji could sense this going on behind him. Why is she crying? Lu Ji wondered, worried that it was because he had drenched what seemed like an important book due to his carelessness. That was the only explanation he could think of. After all, once paper gets wet, even if blown dry, it would still become crinkly. Realizing this made Lu Ji feel even worse, especially since Yang didn't seem to blame him. He glanced back at Yang, but she had returned to her usual self, as if that subtle moment hadn't occurred at all. Seeing him turn around, she smiled at him. This made Lu Ji feel utterly terrible. He wished that Yang would just scold him right now. At least that would make him feel a tad better. In the dense forest, the young swordsman shot through the trees. 30 or so meters ahead, a massive horned bear was on the run. Standing over 2 meters high even when on all fours, the bear's thunderous gallop shook the ground, akin to a charging war chariot. Unfortunately, this chariot was fleeing in panic. Several deep wounds on its body oozed blood, staining the shrubs along the path with blotchy red streaks. You can't escape, the young man with the longsword said, flicking his wrist. A chain shot from his hand, latching onto a large tree ahead of the bear. The giant bear was startled and intended to change directions, but it suddenly sensed a shadow looming over it. Got you, the young man's cold voice rang out like a death knell. Before the bear could react, the sharp longsword pierced the back of its neck. Its artery was severed, and blood sprayed everywhere. With a final, desperate howl, the bear collapsed heavily to the ground, struggled for a moment, then lay lifeless. Huff, job done, the young man muttered, flicking the blood from his sword before sheathing it. He approached the bear and, with one swift motion, hoisted the massive creature onto his shoulder. This should keep us fed for quite some time, he muttered, adjusting the bear's position on his shoulder before nimbly retracing his steps back. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 9, Eat Fresh. Lu Ji felt very strange. His family wasn't well off, so like most people, Lu Ji had attended public schools all his life, never went to cram school or had private tutoring that cost thousands per course. The last time someone taught him one-on-one, meticulously guiding him through each word, was probably back in kindergarten. Now, after God knows how many years as a potato, Lu Ji once again felt like he was a child learning to speak. And the one teaching him word by word was seemingly a young girl that hadn't reached adulthood. Stranger still, while he was learning, his right hand was tied to a pole planted firmly into the ground, with his index finger pointed at the sky. There was no doubt this measure was to prevent Lu Ji from unleashing magic at his own head again. While it felt like he was being treated like a child, Lu Ji also felt somewhat excited. After all, it was magic that he was learning. It felt very much like the first time he visited an internet cafe with friends. Pushing open those glass doors was like opening a portal to a whole new world. Were it not for that mishap resulting in him eating a face full of fire, Lu Ji would probably have been stoked all day just from seeing fire shoot out of his fingertip. Unfortunately, since then, Yang had only taught him isolated syllables instead of complete incantations. Despite his finger being pointed skyward, there wasn't any reaction. However, Lu Ji wasn't anxious. In his opinion, it felt perfectly normal to start from the basics. As he continued learning, Lu Ji gradually discovered that the language of incantations was fascinating. If he could repeatedly pronounce the words, he would naturally start understanding the meaning behind them. And the more he recited, the greater his understanding. Once he realized this, he understood why Yang was teaching him the language of incantations. Perhaps she was trying to establish communication with him this way. It still felt odd, though, that she would teach magic just to talk to a complete stranger like him. Perhaps she had other considerations, but with the language barrier, Lu Ji couldn't even ask if he was curious. While learning, a sudden sound of rustling leaves came from the nearby woods. Both Lu Ji and Yang looked in the direction of the sound and saw the young swordsman returning, with what seemed like a black bear the size of an elephant on his shoulder. Seeing Lu Ji and Yang sitting side by side, then further scanning the surroundings, the young swordsman asked, Yang, where's Osar? Didn't I tell him to watch over you too? I sent him to chop wood, Yang replied, eyeing the giant bear on the young man's shoulder. That's quite a haul, Mervant. Need help freezing it? Yeah, give me a sec. I'll skin it first and cut off a paw, said the young swordsman named Mervant. He found an empty patch of grass and tossed the bear to the ground with a loud thud. Then, he swiftly raised his sword and deftly started skinning the dead bear. Lu Ji gaped at the sight of this. How heavy is that huge bear? A ton? Maybe 2? Holy crap, this brother looks skinny, but he's actually so strong. Are the people in this world just so exceptional? Or are these few I just met especially powerful? Lu Ji suddenly felt fortunate that the trio he encountered seemed to be decent people. He, as a weak and hapless youth, might have been done for if he had stumbled upon some bloodthirsty psychopaths. Well, but he probably couldn't be that unlucky, right? Lu Ji, still mentally anchored in his past life, instinctively thought that good people were still the majority in this world. Despite the bear's massive size, skinning it appeared relatively easy for Mervyn, who could flip the giant carcass effortlessly. His adept skill at this suggested he was no stranger to skinning. Although the skinned bear carcass looked gruesome, Lu Ji, who had seen rabbit skin firsthand at his favorite spicy hot pot restaurant, only needed to imagine it as a supersized rabbit to not feel too disturbed. This enormous hide could make a fine carpet for our new place, saving us from laying cypress branches as bedding, Mervyn said, spreading the entire bear hide across the grassy clearing. Cleaning and tanning it will be your job, Yane. That's easy, Yane responded, gently tapping her staff on the ground. Several small, fluffy, white creatures popped into existence and skittered over to the bear hide. Each one grabbed and lifted a corner, then hopped off toward the river with the whole hide. Arms crossed and watching the little creatures carry the hide away, Mervyn muttered, hey, familiars do make things convenient. Why, want one, provide materials for two, and I'll give you one, Yane offered. No thanks, just thinking about gathering those materials makes my head go numb, replied Mervyn. With a single stroke of his sword, he severed a large bear paw, then shook off the blood from his knife. I'm fine with my blade. It suits you well, so step to the side, please. Yane gestured with her staff. Mervyn sheathed his blade and obediently stepped back with the bear paw in his hand. Lu Ji, still tied to the post, continued his incantation practice while curiously observing them. After Mervyn stepped back, Yane raised her staff. Complex incantations flowed from her lips as an invisible energy swirled around her, causing her hair and robes to flutter. Lu Ji shivered. It had felt like summer just moments ago, but suddenly, it seemed as if winter had arrived. Won't such a sudden change make someone catch a cold? He muttered to himself, huddling up. However, the coldness vanished as quickly as it had come. Yane, having put down her staff, adjusted her robe and sat back down next to Lu Ji. Meanwhile, the giant bear carcass in the distance now sported a thin layer of frost, and even the grass around it was dotted with ice crystals, clearly indicating that the temperature of the entire bear had dropped below freezing in an instant. Whoa, that's some rapid freezing, Lu Ji exclaimed. He had just been wondering if it would be a waste if they couldn't finish eating such a large bear and it spoiled. Now, he wondered if they would share the food with him. He glanced at Mervyn, who was holding the bear paw, and noticed the latter was also looking at him. Then, Mervyn smiled, sliced off a piece of bloody meat from the paw, walked over and handed it over to Lu Ji, and watched expectantly. Lu Ji looked at the raw bear flesh in his hand and then back at Mervyn, completely baffled. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 10, well done. Lu Ji had never eaten raw meat in his life before. Having been raised in a typical Chinese family and accustomed to fully cooked food from school cafeterias, raw meat was a no-go for him. Even his steaks had to be well done. Medium rare was simply out of the question for him. Now faced with a chunk of raw bear meat in another world, Lu Ji wasn't about to start gnawing on it. Lu Ji also didn't like being a freeloader, so after some effort and a bit of charades, he managed to get some basic cooking tools from Yane. The equipment was simple: a pot, a knife, a cutting board, a few wooden bowls, and a small packet of salt. Though basic, it was sufficient for cooking a meal. As for a stove, thanks to his fondness for watching outdoor videos, Lu Ji could set up a simple stone stove as long as someone could help him start a fire. Seeing Lu Ji busy himself by the fire, Mervyn and Yane exchanged glances. Be honest, did you think he was some kind of wild man who'd eat raw meat? Yane asked with a deadpan expression. Mervyn shrugged. After all, he couldn't even speak, right? I told you before, it's not that he can't speak, it's just that there's a language barrier. Yane sighed. Remember when we first met? He switched through 4 or 5 languages trying to communicate with us. If I recall correctly, you only know Dragon Tongue in the common language, right? Is that so? Looks like I was mistaken. Mervyn stroked his chin, realizing his error. Never mind, just don't be like this next time. It was really impolite, Yane said. Thankfully, he didn't seem to mind. Got it, but I've been meaning to ask. Mervyn crossed his arms. Are you maybe a tad too concerned about this mysterious potato man of unknown origins? I've mentioned it before. We need a guide, said Yane, frowning. Why does it have to be him? Shouldn't we try to find someone else? Mervyn countered. Maybe there's someone around who understands our language. Moreover, you were trying to teach him magic. Don't you think this reasoning is a little far-fetched? So, you're suggesting we leave this place and go elsewhere to see if there are other people? Yane said with a tinge of irony. Maybe I'm mistaken. I thought you were the one who most wanted to stay nearby and wait for Calidora. No, that's right, but Mervyn stumbled over his words, scratching his forehead in frustration. I just feel that, for a stranger whose background we know nothing about, you don't need to teach him magic, do you? Why, you think he could defeat you or me after learning to make a fireball? Yane raised an eyebrow. That's not what I meant, Mervyn said. Aren't you worried he might have ulterior motives? You ought to know, I'm an Ifrit, Yane said with furrowed brows. You are only half Ifrit, your perceptual talent isn't complete, Mervyn said. Otherwise, your teacher wouldn't have. The coldness in her voice halted Mervyn's words, and the sudden drop in temperature felt as if winter had arrived. Lu Ji, who had just finished setting up the stove, shivered and turned around to see Yane's robe fluttering, the grass beneath her feet visibly freezing. No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Mervyn stepped back. It was a slip of the tongue, you know that. Yes, I understand very well, Yane hissed through clenched teeth. In the next moment, the chill vanished as if it had never been there, and the ice crystals on the grass beneath Yane's feet slowly dissipated. She was silent for a moment, then spoke again. Mervyn, you need to understand, I'm not like you. No, we aren't that different. Mervyn shook his head. No, you still have Calidora. Yane smiled weakly. But me, I already have nothing left. You, Mervyn got stuck, unsure of what to say. So please, let me be. Yane sighed. I just wish to shroud myself in memories, that's all, okay? Mervyn remained silent for a while, then said, I'll go check the border. Having said that, he entered the forest, disappearing among the dense trees. Lu Ji was a little confused watching Mervyn walk away. Unable to understand a single word that was said, Lu Ji was unable to figure out what had just happened, only that the two seemed to have argued, and the young swordsman had left. It couldn't be a serious fallout, could it? This shouldn't have anything to do with me, right? Lu Ji didn't know, nor did he have any way of asking. He turned to glance at Yane and saw her burying herself in that small notebook again. It seemed likely that it had nothing to do with Lu Ji. Since that was the case, he wouldn't dwell on it. He didn't know how many years it had been since he had meat, and although he wasn't hungry, Lu Ji was definitely craving it. After setting up the mud stove, Lu Ji cut the bear meat into small pieces and gestured for Yane to conjure a pot of water. Once the water boiled, he blanched the bear meat, skimmed the foam, and then lifted the meat out to cool. In the meantime, he scooped out a large bowl of light broth for later use and discarded the rest of the water. As he lacked a spatula, Lu Ji gathered a few evenly sized sticks nearby, washed them, and used them as chopsticks. Next, he tossed some fat trimmings into the pot to render, stirring them with his stick chopsticks. After scooping out some excess oil and solid fatty bits, he added the chunks of bear meat, frying them until they changed color. He then added the bowl of broth, covered the pot, brought it to a boil on high heat, and then reduced it to a simmer. Once the meat was tender, he added a bit of salt, and his plain steamed bear meat dish was ready. Yes, steamed. Lu Ji would have preferred to make a richer braised or stewed dish, but the circumstances limited him. Lu Ji tasted a bit, finding the gamey taste a tad strong, but that was a minor flaw. Although he couldn't expect the complex flavors of modern dishes enhanced by a variety of spices, the pure taste of meat was sufficiently rich. For Lu Ji, who hadn't eaten meat in so long, the flavor was splendid. Delightful flavor. And there was also an inexplicable urge. Almost instantly, Lu Ji realized what this impulse was. He turned around and saw Yane behind him. Swallowing nervously, he forcibly suppressed this impulse. No, now was not the time for experiments. Better to wait until it was quieter at night. The meat from an entire paw was enough to fill the pot to the brim. Lu Ji scooped 2 generous bowls of meat and covered the pot. With more than half the pot still full, there should still be plenty left for the other 2 when they return. Here, Lu Ji approached Yang and handed her one of the bowls. Yang looked up at him, uttered a curt, single syllable, then put away her notebook and took the bowl. That word must mean, thank you, huh? Lu Ji thought as he sat next to Yang, instinctively passing her 2 sticks. Yang was slightly confused, but still accepted these 2 makeshift chopsticks. Lu Ji smiled at her, then using his own set of chopsticks, he picked up a piece of meat, blew on it, and then popped it into his mouth. Considering the conditions, it turned out quite well indeed. Curious to see Yang's reaction toward his cooking, Lu Ji turned to look at her. But as he did, he noticed Yang staring blankly at his right hand. In Yang's right hand, her 2 chopsticks were held extremely awkwardly, forming a perfect cross. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 10, well done. Lu Ji had never eaten raw meat in his life before. Having been raised in a typical Chinese family and accustomed to fully cooked food from school cafeterias, raw meat was a no-go for him. Even his steaks had to be well done. Medium rare was simply out of the question for him. Now faced with a chunk of raw bear meat in another world, Lu Ji wasn't about to start gnawing on it. Lu Ji also didn't like being a freeloader, so after some effort and a bit of charades, he managed to get some basic cooking tools from Yang. The equipment was simple: a pot, a knife, a cutting board, a few wooden bowls, and a small packet of salt. Though basic, it was sufficient for cooking a meal. As for a stove, thanks to his fondness for watching outdoor videos, Lu Ji could set up a simple stone stove as long as someone could help him start a fire. Seeing Lu Ji busy himself by the fire, Mervyn and Yang exchanged glances. Be honest, did you think he was some kind of wild man who'd eat raw meat? Yang asked with a deadpan expression. Mervyn shrugged. After all, he couldn't even speak, right? I told you before, it's not that he can't speak, it's just that there's a language barrier. Yang sighed. Remember when we first met? He switched through 4 or 5 languages trying to communicate with us. If I recall correctly, you only know Dragon Tongue in the common language, right? Is that so? Looks like I was mistaken. Mervyn stroked his chin, realizing his error. Never mind, just don't be like this next time. It was really impolite, Yang said. Thankfully, he didn't seem to mind. Got it, but I've been meaning to ask. Mervyn crossed his arms. Are you maybe a tad too concerned about this mysterious potato man of unknown origins? I've mentioned it before. We need a guide, said Yang, frowning. Why does it have to be him? Shouldn't we try to find someone else? Mervyn countered. Maybe there's someone around who understands our language. Moreover, you were trying to teach him magic. Don't you think this reasoning is a little far-fetched? So, you're suggesting we leave this place and go elsewhere to see if there are other people? Yang said with a tinge of irony. Maybe I'm mistaken. I thought you were the one who most wanted to stay nearby and wait for Calidora. No, that's right, but Mervyn stumbled over his words, scratching his forehead in frustration. I just feel that, for a stranger whose background we know nothing about, you don't need to teach him magic, do you? Why, you think he could defeat you or me after learning to make a fireball? Yang raised an eyebrow. That's not what I meant, Mervyn said. Aren't you worried he might have ulterior motives? You ought to know, I'm an Ifrit, Yang said with furrowed brows. You are only half Ifrit, your perceptual talent isn't complete, Mervyn said. Otherwise, your teacher wouldn't have. The coldness in her voice halted Mervyn's words, and the sudden drop in temperature felt as if winter had arrived. Lu Ji, who had just finished setting up the stove, shivered and turned around to see Yang's robe fluttering, the grass beneath her feet visibly freezing. No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Mervyn stepped back. It was a slip of the tongue, you know that. Yes, I understand very well, Yang hissed through clenched teeth. In the next moment, the chill vanished as if it had never been there, and the ice crystals on the grass beneath Yang's feet slowly dissipated. She was silent for a moment, then spoke again. Mervyn, you need to understand, I'm not like you. No, we aren't that different. Mervyn shook his head. No, you still have Calidora. Yang smiled weakly, but me, I already have nothing left. You, Mervyn got stuck, unsure of what to say. So please, let me be. Yang sighed. I just wish to shroud myself in memories, that's all, okay? Mervyn remained silent for a while, then said, I'll go check the border. Having said that, he entered the forest, disappearing among the dense trees. Lu Ji was a little confused watching Mervyn walk away. Unable to understand a single word that was said, Lu Ji was unable to figure out what had just happened, only that the two seemed to have argued, and the young swordsman had left. It couldn't be a serious fallout, could it? This shouldn't have anything to do with me, right? Lu Ji didn't know, nor did he have any way of asking. He turned to glance at Yang and saw her burying herself in that small notebook again. It seemed likely that it had nothing to do with Lu Ji. Since that was the case, he wouldn't dwell on it. He didn't know how many years it had been since he had meat, and although he wasn't hungry, Lu Ji was definitely craving it. After setting up the mud stove, Lu Ji cut the bear meat into small pieces and gestured for Yang to conjure a pot of water. Once the water boiled, he blanched the bear meat, skimmed the foam, and then lifted the meat out to cool. In the meantime, he scooped out a large bowl of light broth for later use and discarded the rest of the water. As he lacked a spatula, Lu Ji gathered a few evenly sized sticks nearby, washed them, and used them as chopsticks. Next, he tossed some fat trimmings into the pot to render, stirring them with his stick chopsticks. After scooping out some excess oil and solid fatty bits, he added the chunks of bear meat, frying them until they changed color. He then added the bowl of broth, covered the pot, brought it to a boil on high heat, and then reduced it to a simmer. Once the meat was tender, he added a bit of salt, and his plain steamed bear meat dish was ready. Yes, steamed. Lu Ji would have preferred to make a richer braised or stewed dish, but the circumstances limited him. Lu Ji tasted a bit, finding the gamey taste a tad strong, but that was a minor flaw. Although he couldn't expect the complex flavors of modern dishes enhanced by a variety of spices, the pure taste of meat was sufficiently rich. For Lu Ji, who hadn't eaten meat in so long, the flavor was splendid. Delightful flavor. And there was also an inexplicable urge. Almost instantly, Lu Ji realized what this impulse was. He turned around and saw Yang behind him. Swallowing nervously, he forcibly suppressed this impulse. No, now was not the time for experiments. Better to wait until it was quieter at night. The meat from an entire paw was enough to fill the pot to the brim. Lu Ji scooped 2 generous bowls of meat and covered the pot. With more than half the pot still full, there should still be plenty left for the other 2 when they return. Here, Lu Ji approached Yang and handed her one of the bowls. Yang looked up at him, uttered a curt, single syllable, then put away her notebook and took the bowl. That word must mean, thank you, huh? Lu Ji thought as he sat next to Yang, instinctively passing her 2 sticks. Yang was slightly confused, but still accepted these 2 makeshift chopsticks. Lu Ji smiled at her, then using his own set of chopsticks, he picked up a piece of meat, blew on it, and then popped it into his mouth. Considering the conditions, it turned out quite well indeed. Curious to see Yang's reaction toward his cooking, Lu Ji turned to look at her. But as he did, he noticed Yang staring blankly at his right hand. In Yang's right hand, her 2 chopsticks were held extremely awkwardly, forming a perfect cross. Chapter 11. 3 Years of Learning Animation. Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Huff, ha, Osar roared, chopping with his hand, and causing a tower tree to come crashing down. Then, continuing to use his hand as a chopping blade, he neatly trimmed the entire tree from top to bottom, turning it into a cylindrical log. Phew, that's the last one, he breathed, shaking his hands to cool his palms down. It's easy to chop, but a hassle to bring back. Osar sighed, loosening his shoulders, then put a hand inside his shirt and rubbed his body. After some rubbing, he successfully got a bunch of fur. He then rolled the fur in his hands into a tight sphere, then pinched and shaped it into an abstract figure resembling that of a small person. He threw the furball figure onto the ground, and with a thud, it transformed into an abstract version of Osar. How abstract was it? Imagine something that looked like it was modeled by someone who had roughly spent 3 years of learning animation. Despite its crude look, Osar seemed quite satisfied. He inspected his abstract self and nodded. Not bad, you can handle this log. The abstract version obediently nodded, picked up the log from the ground, and hoisted it onto its shoulder. With his abstract self in tow, Osar retraced his steps according to what he remembered. As he walked, he continuously created more abstract clones of himself from furballs. He had scoured for suitable trees along the way earlier, chopping them down and shaping them. Now, on his way back, he could collect all these logs and bring them back. Of course, it was these clones that did the carrying. After all, so many logs would be too much for one person to handle alone. About an hour later, Osar returned to the camp, leading a parade of several dozen abstract clones of himself. By this time, he was far from the relaxed figure he had been an hour earlier. Exhausted, panting heavily, and with his tongue hanging out, he promptly slumped down as soon as he reached the camp. The furball clones instantly transformed back into furballs, resulting in a symphony of logs thudding to the ground. He had only sat down when he suddenly caught a whiff of a tantalizing aroma of meat. Looking up, he saw Lu Ji and Yang each holding a bowl of steamed meat near the fire pit. And a little farther away, the frozen carcass of a huge bear was still giving off a cold mist. What the heck, there's meat? His eyes lit up as he suddenly found the energy to get up and hurried over to the fire pit. As he lifted the lid of the pot, the rich and pure aroma of meat hit him full in the face. He inhaled deeply, swallowed his saliva, then grabbed a wooden bowl that was set aside. Without fear of the heat, he picked up the pot from the fire and poured himself a full bowl of bear meat. After replacing the pot in its lid, Osar sat down next to the others, reaching out intending to grab a piece and throw it into his mouth. At that moment, 2 sticks were suddenly shoved in front of him. Wait, don't use your hands. It's unhygienic, Yang said, showing off her own chopsticks before passing the spare pair that Lu Ji had set aside. Osar took the chopsticks with a baffled expression, scrutinizing them carefully before he glanced at Yang. Yang smiled slightly, very slowly picked up a piece of meat with her chopsticks, and placed it in her mouth, then gave Osar a small nod. Osar watched her hand movements, blinked several times, then looked again at the chopsticks in his hand. He carefully adjusted the positions of the sticks in his hand and gently squeezed. A perfect cross was formed. On the precipice of a cliff, Mervyn chewed on a thin blade of grass while gazing into the distance. On his side of the cliff, the vegetation was lush and the meadows stretched endlessly. On the other side, however, was a boundless desert, its horizon seemingly boundless. Gazing at the extremity of the desert, Mervyn sighed listlessly and murmured to himself, Callie, you guys must be all right, right? It was phrased as a question, but it sounded more like a prayer. Mervyn had hoped that coming here might allow him to find those he was waiting for sooner, but the more he stared at the endless desert before him, the more uneasy he felt. With another sigh, Mervyn leaned against the rock wall, dangling his right leg off the cliff, and began to hum a tune. It was a ballad from his homeland, familiar to all his kin. Anyone of his kind could hum a few bars. Sadly, the number of people in the entire world that still remembered this melody now was few. Humming the tune brought back images of Dragon City, his old home built of obsidian, the coolest city in the world. It was a place where the brightest flowers bloomed, trees laced with gold flourished, and humans and dragons lived in harmony. Even the streets were dazzling with jewels. Back then, he loved to sneak out and roam the commercial streets all day with Calidora, dodging every adult they knew because being caught meant a stern talking to at home. Thinking back, the person who most loved to hum this tune was his strict father, though he wasn't very good at it. Most notes were off-key, and one wasn't even on the scale, which always earned a tease from Mervyn's mother. Mervyn was thinking of home again. Ha, what's gotten into me? Why am I acting like a kid? Mervyn muttered as he sat up and spit out the grass stem. It was about time to head back. Building the cabin was not a job for Osar alone. Mervyn didn't fancy the roof collapsing on him someday. Just as Mervyn was about to head back the way he had come, he subconsciously turned for one last look at the desert behind. In that fleeting glance, something about the scenery struck him as slightly off. When he turned back for a closer look, however, he saw nothing unusual. Someone else might have dismissed it as ice playing tracks on him, but Mervyn paused, feeling uneasy. He briefly closed his eyes, then suddenly reopened them, his pupils swirling with a golden glow, taking in the landscape for miles around. In the next instant, he abruptly shut his eyes again. When he reopened them, his eyes had returned to normal, but his expression was grim. Damn it, we left a tail, he cursed under his breath. With a swift motion, he leapt down the backside of the cliff, racing back to camp with utmost urgency. Chapter 12. Can't we have a meal in peace? Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. No, I've said it before, it's physiologically impossible, Osar argued while holding a chopstick in his hand. Look at how thick my fingers are plus the pads. It's impossible to use these sticks to pick up food. So, it's perfectly fine for me to use my hands. Don't give me that. I know very well how agile a fighter's fingers can be. Yang dismissed his excuse. You just don't want to learn. You could definitely do it if you really tried. No, I really can't. I've already tried. Osar protested vehemently. Can't you just let me use my hands? No, that's unhygienic. Yang shook her head. And you only tried once. Try a few more times. I believe you can pick it up. But I don't believe I can, Osar groaned, thumping his thigh in exasperation. I just want to eat. Lu Ji, holding his wooden bowl and eating quietly, might not have understood the specifics of their conversation, but it didn't stop him from enjoying the show. After solitude for so many years, just having some lively company felt great. Just then, a dark figure descended from the sky. Ah, Mervyn, you're back. Osar's face lit up as if seeing a lifeline. Come and settle this for us. They insist I use these 2 sticks to eat meat. Can you believe this? Sorry, let's discuss such trivial matters later, Mervyn said solemnly. We have a tale. Upon hearing this, Osar and Yang tensed up. Are you sure? How many are there? Yang asked. I'm certain. A standard squad of 12, Mervyn replied, glancing at Lu Ji, who appeared utterly confused. What about him? Should we have him turn into a potato and hide for a bit? No need, we can just let him stay here, Osar said as he put down his bowl and stretched his limbs. We can't let this place be exposed. We'll intercept them up ahead. Agreed, we have left too many traces of activity here. We can't give them a chance to investigate and send messages back. Yang also put down her utensils and picked up her staff. Seeing the 3 suddenly getting serious and gearing up as if ready for a confrontation, Lu Ji felt bewildered. After all, he knew next to nothing about this world or these people. His first thought was that they were about to face bandits or robbers. But when he thought about it, they barely had a camp, without even a tent. It was unlikely that they had been specifically targeted. Considering none of them seemed like bad people and each seemed extraordinarily capable, Lu Ji guessed they might be facing someone out for revenge. He looked worriedly at Yang and noticed she was also looking at him. Then, unexpectedly, the young girl reached out and patted his head. Lu Ji felt a bit awkward, wanting to protest but not knowing how to express it. While he was still conflicted, Yang withdrew her hand and then gestured to him. Lu Ji roughly understood that she was telling him to stay put and wait for them to return. Although Lu Ji was worried, he really didn't know what to say due to the unclear situation, and even if he wanted to say something, he couldn't articulate it. After some hesitation, he could only nod. Yang sent a faint smile at him, before turning to say something to the others. Then, the three of them dashed off into the dense forest together. As he watched their figures gradually get smaller in the distance, Lu Ji glanced down at the steamed meat in front of him. A nearly full bowl of steamed meat was untouched, yet he no longer felt like eating. It wasn't that he was full. Rather, after the flurry of activity, the idea of eating alone in silence seemed particularly unappetizing. Should I follow them? Lu Ji wondered to himself. That's not impossible. But before that, he might try something. Lu Ji walked over to the spellbook that was being caressed by a gentle breeze. Thanks to the relentless efforts of a certain green bird, the book had almost dried, although the pages had become somewhat wrinkled as expected. But that didn't matter. Relying on the single syllables he had just learned, perhaps Lu Ji could master a few simple spells. Though he vaguely felt that the kind of magic that burst forth uncontrollably from his fingertip might not really count as having learned it, that wasn't important. What mattered was being able to use it. And then, on top of that, he felt the strange surge of impulse within his body. There was no one around, so perhaps it was time to try it out. But, before recalling this impulse, he ought to first take off his clothes. A standard squad of 12, 2 shield guards, 2 clerics, 2 archers, 2 mages, 2 scouts, and 2 elite warriors. Hidden behind a huge rock atop the cliff, Mervyn was making strategic plans. Given they're concentrated because of the desert, now is the best time to ambush them. I can take out their archers and mages, but you need to buy me some time. Usual rules, then. I take the front line, and Yang provides support, Osar said. No, that won't work. Giranini and Turnox aren't here, and their scouts could easily keep me occupied, Yang objected. If I get held up, you'll be in danger. Yes, that's the problem, Mervyn added. We're short-handed. Their shield guards and elite warriors will require Yang's attention. This will be a tough fight. Prepare yourselves mentally. FK, how did these bastards even track us down here? Osar scratched his head in frustration. There's nothing surprising about that. A dog's nose is always keener than a person's. And we are all well aware that the desert might stop the common folk but not the tyrant's claws, Yang remarked offhandedly, then looked at Mervyn. So, what's the plan? Lure out their scouts first for an ambush? That would be ideal, but it's too risky. Mervyn shook his head. Their scouts are especially quick. Attacking them might expose us and lead to a counter chase. Desert terrain doesn't favor retreats. If we get cornered into a direct fight, we would be in big trouble. Yang frowned, but letting them get close before we strike could complicate things further. Any ideas? Of course, and that's to use this, Mervyn said, stamping on the rocky ground. This cliff itself is our biggest advantage, a natural fortress. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 13, To a Potato? In the desert, the 12-man squad was advancing slowly. Though their body types and gear varied, their attire was uniformly styled, brown standard armor paired with orange-red cloaks, making them look less like an army or adventurers and more like a ceremonial unit. A special energy enveloped the group, not only shielding them from sandstorms but also concealing them in the harsh desert light. What was most strange was the look in their eyes. Despite merely trudging slowly through the desert, their eyes burned with a fervor as if fueled by flames. It would make sense if they were charging heroically. Their mere slow march through the desert made this expression seem quite out of place. Suddenly, a figure appeared, a very abstract-looking anthropomorphic tiger, swaying in front of them like a wobbly toy. Almost instantaneously, the squad sprang into action as if they were a cat that had its tail stepped on. They swiftly formed a battle array as if they were machines set to a program. Protective barriers shielded the formation as the scouts quickly dispersed to the sides, blending into the desert dust. Elite warriors charged forward, making a beeline toward the abstract anthropomorphic tiger. Archers began firing at the target immediately, alternating shots from a crossbow and a bow. And under the protection of shield guards, the mages began chanting rapidly. In an instant, arrows hit the abstract anthropomorphic tiger, throwing darts from shadows flashing by in the periphery struck the tiger's vital points, and the elite warriors arrived, their swords crossing and slicing the tiger into 3 parts. A moment later, the mages completed their incantations, and a meteorite, accompanied by destructive beams of starlight, descended from the sky, striking the already severed tiger and exploding with terrifying force. After this brutal assault, not even the ashes of the unfortunate abstract anthropomorphic tiger remained. Atop the sheer cliff, Osar watched as his fur clone sacrificed itself heroically, his mouth twitching as he muttered, "Every time I see them react this way, I don't know whether to praise their caution or call them idiots." You might as well enjoy it while you can. I doubt anyone else would treat your fur clones with such regard, Mervyn teased. If those things knew how to tire, then I really could enjoy myself a bit. Osar shrugged. Enough chattering. They've started looking for our position, Yang interjected, frowning. Mervyn, what do you think? Do we stand a chance? Of course, from what we just saw, they're just the typical dumb squad, Mervyn replied, drawing his sword. It's a pity we're short-handed this time. Otherwise, this would be easy. Yang glanced at him and whispered, don't underestimate the enemy. I know, Mervyn replied curtly, then leapt from the cliff. 3, 2, 1. About time. I'm going to. Keep an eye on me, Osar said, and then he too jumped down from the cliff. Seeing this, Yang took a deep breath and raised her staff. Ha, just don't die before I'm ready, you two. It should be this direction. Inside the dense forest, Lu Ji was following the direction where the 3 had gone. Although the path was steep and the underbrush was thick, Lu Ji found it unexpectedly easy to navigate. This felt strikingly different from his past experiences, where he remembered becoming quickly exhausted when searching for human settlements along a water source. After years of inactivity while being a potato, he expected his fitness to have declined significantly, yet it seemed to have strangely improved instead. On closer examination, Lu Ji noticed he had developed muscles he didn't have before. The idea that he could gain muscle while living as a potato was something he hadn't anticipated. After all, weren't potatoes just full of starch? Shouldn't he have just gotten fatter instead? But regardless, it was rather good this way, so why bother questioning it? As his mind wandered with such thoughts, Lu Ji suddenly sensed a strange ripple from afar. Is that magic or something? Lu Ji was alarmed. Has the fighting started already? Realizing the urgency, Lu Ji didn't waste another moment and ran toward the source of the fluctuation. As he ran, he became increasingly aware of something peculiar. Had he always run this fast? Despite the rugged terrain, his speed felt more akin to sprinting than trekking through undergrowth. Moreover, he was picking up speed effortlessly as if riding the wind through the trees. The brush and leaves that slapped against him didn't hurt, and he easily dodged the many obstacles like trees and rocks. Is this really my body? Lu Ji even questioned himself. He now let go completely, allowing his speed to reach its full potential. The surrounding scenery whizzed by like a roadside tree seen from a speeding car on the highway, and he felt that at this rate, he could probably give cars a run for their money. For the first time, Lu Ji, who never found any pleasure in running, felt the exhilaration of it. The thrill of unstoppable speed. Lu Ji continued charging forward without hesitation. Until suddenly, the ground beneath his feet vanished. What the? Before him lay a vast desert and a sheer drop of several hundred meters. In that instant, Lu Ji's body twisted backward in a bizarre manner. Driven by a fierce will to survive, he managed to twist his center of gravity, and the foot that had stepped off the cliff planted back to solid ground, while his hands instinctively grabbed the leaves of some plant and pulled himself back. With a thud, Lu Ji sat down on solid ground. Fortunately, he had managed to stop himself just in time before he became an inadvertent victim of gravity. Holy crap, how can there be a cliff here? Lu Ji panted heavily, clutching his chest. Having spent God knows how many years as a potato, just barely surviving, it would have been too much if he had died by falling off a cliff. But the glimpse he had caught just before almost falling. At the thought of this, Lu Ji cautiously crawled forward, peered over the cliff again, and looked down. Below, he could make out some figures in the distance. Isn't that the tiger guy getting attacked? Lu Ji squinted, trying to get a clearer view. And that black winged one, looks like the swordsman. How many are they taking on? 7, 8, 9. There's one lying on the ground. So, it's 2 against 10, and they managed to draw the first blood? It's impressive, but looking at them now, it seems that they were at a disadvantage now. Wait, where's the girl? Lu Ji suddenly remembered. He had followed her magical fluctuations here. He scanned the area below more carefully but couldn't spot Yane. However, he did notice something else. There were 2 shadows rapidly climbing up the cliffside. Wait a minute, 2 more, and they're climbing up. Why? Lu Ji looked up in the direction they were climbing. And then, he spotted Yane. She was just actually on the cliff only about 100 or so meters away from Lu Ji. At that moment, she was floating in the air, holding her staff high, her eyes closed, chanting a long and complex incantation. As someone who had played online games before, Lu Ji almost immediately realized what was happening. Damn, they are trying to interrupt a mage's channeling. At that moment, Lu Ji, who had never been in a fight in his life, found the courage to run toward Yane without a second thought. Although he had only known this girl, whose name he still didn't know, for a few hours and they couldn't even speak the same language, Lu Ji genuinely felt cared for and respected in their interaction. In his heart, he had already come to consider Yane as a comrade, or at least, a friend. And she was the first, and only, friend he had made in many years. A friend was in need, so he had to help. Just based on this simple concept, Lu Ji rushed toward Yane. Just then, one of the climbing figures reached the top of the cliff. Yane, sensing someone's approach, opened her eyes. There was a flicker of an orange-red cape, and a sharp, icy-cold curved dagger came slicing toward her. Not good. How did they get here so quickly? Yane's heart clenched. With a thought, the trap she had prepared with magic erupted. With the delay trap activated, time in the area seemed to slow down. But this effect only lasted for a moment. The scout's cape flashed, and his slowed speed returned to normal. Yane was waiting for this moment. Behind her, another trap quietly activated. A barrage of colorful magic missiles traced bizarre arcs and honed in on the scout from all directions. The scout hurriedly waved his dagger to defend, but the trajectories of the magic missiles were inherently unpredictable and almost simultaneously reached him, hitting him squarely. He was blown off the cliff by several such hits. The combined effects of paralysis, freezing, cursing, and other magic missiles, though each not very strong, were enough to immobilize him temporarily. With eyes wide open, he helplessly fell from a height of several hundred meters and crashed into the ground, turning into pulp. Having successfully dealt with an enemy, Yane didn't relax, because she knew that if one scout arrived, it meant that. She hadn't even finished that thought when yet another figure appeared within her field of vision. Due to the short preparation time, she couldn't set up more traps in advance. Now, she was completely defenseless. Moreover, her incantation wasn't complete yet. Under such circumstances, her only option would be to stop. Her gaze shifted to the battlefield below. Amid the melee, Osar was besieged by the 2 elite warriors and 2 archers, barely managing to fend off their relentless attacks. Mervant, with his remarkable prowess, was holding his own against the 2 shield guards and clerics but struggled to reach the remaining mage, who was well protected. Yane instantly understood the gravity of the situation. If she halted her incantation now, she might survive, but Osar and Mervant would likely face dire consequences. What should she do? Logic told her to stop. If she was cut down, then Mervant and Osar would be utterly without any support. But if she stopped, she was unsure they could withstand until her next incantation was ready. Moreover, she could sense that the opposing mage's attack was also aimed at her. The opposing mage's incantation time was no shorter than hers, and if it was some sort of long-lasting binding magic, she might never get a chance to complete an incantation of this magnitude again. That would mean losing her 2 companions as well. Yane couldn't decide. She knew she could stop, and she could only stop. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to cease her incantation as she watched the second curved dagger inch closer and closer. At that moment, an unexpected figure appeared in her line of sight. It was a flash of vibrant green, the color of Lu Ji's long hair. He rushed toward her at an inconceivable pace, delivering a flying kick at the leaping scout. Clang. A metallic crash resonated. In the final moment, the scout had retracted his dagger and used it to block Lu Ji's flying kick. Then, his body twisted bizarrely midair, turning over 90 degrees without any apparent leverage, and he kicked back at Lu Ji. However, unexpectedly, or perhaps even to Lu Ji's own surprise, Lu Ji instinctively raised his left hand and effortlessly blocked the kick. Yes, instinctively. Because Lu Ji's attention wasn't here, it was entirely concentrated on his own raised right hand. Pointing his index finger at the foe's head, he recited a brief multisyllabic incantation. Intense flames burst forth from his fingertip, engulfing the scout with such exaggerated power and range that it almost swallowed him whole. However, the spell Lu Ji chanted was merely a basic spell, which meant to emit flames. For a moment, Lu Ji almost believed that he had vanquished the foe and even began to worry whether he had taken a life. But he almost instantly realized his triumph was premature. The flames dissipated in a second, revealing the unscathed scout, his cloak shimmering with a bright light that suggested some form of protective magic. And in this moment, the scout's right hand was thrust forward. Lu Ji looked down, to find the scout's sharp dagger had pierced his abdomen, and blood flowed. He was immediately aware that this was a potentially mortal wound. The scout's face bore a maniacal smile, reveling in the strike. Yane's eyes were wide open, her pupils shrunken in disbelief, and the words on her tongue nearly ceased. Then, the scout drew out his dagger, and blood started spurting out from the gaping wound. Intense pain rippled through Lu Ji's body, causing him to nearly black out. He couldn't even make a sound as he crashed to the ground. As the pain seared through him, a final thought echoed in Lu Ji's consciousness. He could sense that his life was coming to an end. Although he had died once before, the endless darkness and unknown terror now seemed about to engulf him. But he was helpless, because he knew this wound was fatal to a human. To a human? To a human? At that moment, Lu Ji realized something. Chapter 14. Oh my, this shouldn't be applauded. Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. What would happen if a person was stabbed in the stomach? Firstly, there would surely be a significant amount of blood loss. Without timely stemming of the bleeding, the person might die from excessive blood loss. Then, there would be damage to internal organs. If the knife wound was deep enough, it might cause organs to rupture and intestinal contents to leak into the abdominal cavity, which would ultimately lead to death. But what would happen if a potato received a stab? It seemed like nothing much would happen, just that if this potato were for sale in the supermarket, it would likely be left until the last by picky customers. Thud. A potato plant fell onto the blood-stained ground. This potato plant seemed to be of normal size, just like any other wild potato plants one might find in the wilderness. However, the branches of this potato seemed particularly crisp, and the few potatoes on its roots were as round and lustrous as white jade. Just that there was a gash on one of the potatoes that went straight through it. This once mortal wound now had no effect on its life. The scout looked at the potato plant on the ground in astonishment, then raised his curved dagger. He had clearly seen that person turned into this potato plant. He had no idea why this person had turned into potatoes, but he didn't need to know, nor did he need to care. All he knew was that he needed to slaughter all enemies who dared resist the true king. He swung his dagger down. Even if it was just a potato, he would chop it up into shreds. At this moment, an unexpected change took place. Roar. A deafening roar erupted, and the harmless potato sprout instantly expanded, transforming in the blink of an eye into a terrifying giant bear several meters tall. The bear's fur was a vibrant green, and it had a horn on its head that shone like a diamond. Its muscles were bulging, and between the fur, there seemed to be a luminescent glow. Even stranger still, for some reason, there seemed to be a patch of fur missing from the bear's belly. The scout, originally intending to chop the potatoes on the ground, hadn't anticipated this transformation and couldn't turn away in time. He could only look up helplessly as a huge bear paw came crashing down on his head. Crunch. Under that glowing green bear paw, the scout was flattened without resistance, like garlic on a chopping board. Seeing blood splatter beneath his paw, Lu Ji, or rather, the entire bear, was stunned. He slowly lifted his paw, only to see fresh blood, shriveled skin, and a section of severed intestine trickling down. There was a surge of acid reflux. Blair. The steamed meat he had just consumed and not yet digested was vomited out. Lu Ji staggered back a few steps and collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, but then felt another wave of cramps in his stomach and puked once more. Yang had a complicated expression as she saw Lu Ji retch continuously. But it was just a glance, and she quickly returned her attention elsewhere. Though her crisis had been temporarily resolved, it wasn't yet time to be distracted. She continued chanting her incantation, and the magic around her began to flow once again. Although there had been a pause, she hadn't completely stopped chanting. Now that she was continuing, her final incantation was completed in just a few seconds. Then, she raised her staff high and pointed it at the enemy mage floating in the air protected by the shield guards. A black magic array expanded in midair, with symbols of destruction positioned in all directions, and a trembling thunder gathered from the void. Rumble, rumble. Black lightning tore through the sky, directly targeting the opposing mage and the shield guards before him. The shield guards did not evade, they fulfilled their duty, raising their shields to meet the lightning head-on. Their massive golden shields shimmered with a dazzling light, and their orange-red cloaks flared up like flames. However, against the relentless black thunder, all these defenses seemed so fragile. The cloak caught fire and soon turned to ashes. The giant shield shattered, and before the shield guards could react, they were obliterated by the lightning. Eventually, the mage and cleric hidden behind the shields were turned into ashes when the shields crumbled. Mervant, who was nearby, breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing this. He had been unable to locate the positions of the enemy scouts and had been worried about Yang. But since she had successfully unleashed her spell, there seemed to be no problem. Now, he just needed to clean up the battlefield, and they could all return and have a good meal. With a swing of his long sword and black dragon wings unfurling behind him, Mervant became a black blur that streaked toward the other side of the battlefield. An archer, who was still eagerly firing at Osar, hadn't even reacted before Mervant sliced through his neck. The other archer did notice Mervant as a result. However, the only advantage he gained was being aware of his own impending demise. First flash, an arrow was struck down. Second flash, the bow was cut through. Third flash, a head was severed from a body. The headless corpse crashed to the ground, blood gushing out from the carotid artery. With the loss of the cleric and shield guards, the two archers were as vulnerable as weevils before Mervant. No longer restrained by the archers, Osar finally switched from defense to offense. Having been frustrated throughout the battle, he now unleashed his fury, fiercely assaulting the two elite warriors. Fist against fist, he pounded until his opponent's knuckles shattered. Leg against leg, he kicked until his opponent's leg bones broke. When knuckles and leg bones were shattered, Osar continued pounding them until paralysis. Unleashing his fists and feet, Osar displayed his astonishing physical strength, brutally beating the two elite warriors into crumpled heaps with his extremely aggressive attacks. Even after the two warriors were left gasping for air, unable to breathe in, Osar still grabbed them and violently smashed them against the hard cliff wall, turning these brave elite warriors into battered rags. It was evident that having been suppressed in a 4-on-1 fight for the entire battle, he had a considerable amount of pent-up rage. Vented enough, Mervant landed beside Osar, flicked the blood off his sword, then sheathed it. Huff, I guess so. Osar exhaled deeply, casually pulling out a broken arrow stuck in his body. I just moved a pile of logs before this, and I was running low on energy. Lucky for me, support from you guys came just in time. Yeah, I also misjudged a bit. Mervant looked at the charred fragments of shields on the ground far away. Without Callie here, getting past their guards was tougher than I thought. Ha, so Giranini was spot on. Osar chuckled as he nudged Mervant. Could it be that our invincible Lord Mervant has really been spoiled by Calidora? Peefed, cut it out. That fellow could talk a bird out of a tree. Mervant dismissively brushed off Osar's arm. Yeah, she could probably talk a whole flock out. Osar sighed, but honestly, it's quite lonely without her around. Yeah, you're right. Mervant gazed toward the vast wasteland. I wonder how they are doing now. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 15. Can't stomach. Blair. Lu Ji vomited another mouthful of stomach acid. He had been unable to control his gag reflex all this while, and having already emptied his stomach, all that came out now was pure gastric juice. Yang squatted by Lu Ji's side, patting his back, trying to make him feel better. Nearby, Mervant's gaze wandered. He was unsure where to look. After all, Lu Ji was completely naked, leaning against a tree trunk and puking, which was somewhat hard to watch. Yang, what's wrong with him? Osar asked as he approached. It's his first time killing, and the scene was somewhat. Yang raised her chin toward a nearby area. You mean this mess? Mervant glanced down at the mashed up remains by his feet. I was wondering what kind of magic could have this effect. I never imagined it to be the doing of this fellow. Osar walked over to Mervant, took a look, and drew a sharp breath. Sheesh, this is indeed, how should I say, too intense for a first kill. But how did he manage it? It's a bit complicated to explain. Yang mused for a bit, and went on, putting it simply, you guys can think of him as a druid who can transform into a bear spirit. He can turn into a bear besides a potato? Mervant raised an eyebrow, and seeing how it went, looks like he's pretty strong in combat too. Yes, it was all thanks to him, otherwise, my spellcasting might have been interrupted. Yang shrugged, their scouts climbed the mountain much faster than we anticipated. Without his help, we would have really been in danger. Ha ha ha, we should really thank him, then. Osar grinned, hands on his hips. I told you this fellow was a good lad. Seems my judgment isn't bad, Didn't I remember you talking about his muscles or something before? Mervant's lips twitched. Yeah, if a person's muscles are good, then that person surely can't be bad, right? Osar said cheerfully. That's, alright, whatever you say. Mervant shrugged, but we do owe him one. Yes, not many can make you owe them, Yang said subtly. But maybe you should try being a bit nicer to him first. I think I've been rather friendly. Mervant put up his hands in a show of innocence. Yang pursed her lips, noncommittal. But this is a cliff of several hundred meters. Without your help, even I would find it tough to climb up. How did those two scouts get up so quickly? Osar suddenly asked. Probably because of this, Mervant said, and with his foot, he kicked out a metal claw from the heap of mashed flesh beside them. Scaling claws, and they're the high-end enchanted sort that supports while walking? Osar frowned. Strange, they've never had this kind of equipment before. Yeah, they didn't before, but now they do. Mervant grimaced. Didn't you say before that the tyrant had no reason to reach his claws across the desert? Now it seems he really doesn't need any reason to reach wherever he wishes. That's just great. Osar sighed. So, as long as that bastard is alive, there won't be any peace in the world, So what, do we continue going deeper? But I remember those fellers telling us that we can't go too far. We have no other choice. If need be, we'll have to continue venturing into unknown areas, Yang said as she helped the pale-faced Lu Ji to his feet. It seemed like Lu Ji was finally recovering somewhat. He was still breathing heavily, but at least he wasn't puking to the point of being unable to stand straight anymore. But for now, we can stay here a bit longer, Yang said as she supported Lu Ji and made their way to the camp. On one hand, we're still waiting for others, and on the other hand, before we slink away with our tails between our legs, I want to knock out a few more teeth. Upon returning to the camp, Lu Ji dug a hole and buried himself in it. And then, he reverted back into a potato plant. It wasn't that he became reclusive. Although this was Lu Ji's first time killing someone, the act of killing itself did not make him feel guilty. With regard to his own mental state, he felt that it was unexpected yet reasonable. After all, before he had crushed the unfortunate soul, the foe's curved dagger had pierced his abdomen first. He would really be foolish if he still felt guilty after that. Still, lacking guilt was one thing, but physical revulsion leading to vomiting was another matter. The image of intestines dripping down his palm, especially, still made his insides churn. At least, as a potato, his stomach would feel much better. And now that he had violently vomited most of his stomach acid, he still couldn't bring himself to eat a hearty bowl of stewed meat. Rather than watching others eat while he starved, he preferred to happily photosynthesize in the ground. Lu Ji, in a potato state, was unaware that the others were staring at him intently. He really turned into a potato. Osar was carefully touching Lu Ji's glossy leaves. What do you mean, really? Didn't you see him transform from a potato into a human with your own eyes previously? Mervyn retorted. That's true, but it still feels so unreal, Osar muttered. And wasn't he much larger last time? How has he become so small now? Concentration is essence. Ever heard of that? Yang remarked offhandedly. His magical energy concentration is frighteningly high right now, probably because all that large body mass has condensed into this small plant. Then, she tapped Mervyn's shoulder with the notebook she was holding. Mervyn took the notebook. What's this? Blueprints, Yang explained. You two stop slacking off and come eat. While we eat, we'll discuss the details of the house. I don't want to sleep on the ground tonight, and we don't have much time left today, so we need to hurry. Question. Osar raised his hand. Ask, Yang responded. To speed up eating, may I use my hands? Osar asked. What else would you use if not your hands? We didn't prepare any utensils for you. Mervyn, unaware of the backstory, made an ignorant remark. No, didn't I tell you before? Osar retorted, exasperated. She previously made me use 2 wood sticks as utensils to pick up the meat, saying it was more convenient and hygienic. 2 wood sticks? Mervyn looked toward Yang in bewilderment. Yes, 2 sticks. Yang casually pulled out her own chopsticks, showing Mervyn how to use them. They're very handy and hygienic, and they don't dirty your hands. I've decided that from now on we'll eat with these. Well, but you guys are off the hook for this meal. Wait a minute, you big cat, don't just grab. At least go wash your hands first. Chapter 16.1. Why do I, as a potato, still have to study? Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Lu Ji felt that perhaps he had been a potato for far too long. So long that he only felt at peace after turning into a potato. However, he understood that this peace was imaginary. When fighting, he had once turned into a potato. Indeed, at that moment, he instinctively felt unparalleled peace and a sense of safety. But, on the other hand, his rationality made him feel a contrary sense of intense unease. He couldn't see or hear. Being in the dangerous situation without his 5 senses was like having his life in the hands of the enemy. That didn't feel good, not good at all. That was why Lu Ji, in the next moment, had changed form once more into a huge bear. That's right, the moment he had consumed that first piece of bear meat, Lu Ji knew that he could turn into a huge bear. Perhaps, his ability wasn't turning into a potato but rather, turning into whatever he consumed. However, this inexplicable ability came without a manual or a system to explain it, leaving Lu Ji clueless about its scope, strength, and usage details. He could only figure it out slowly over time. In any case, exploring this ability of his would need long-term consideration. But first, he had to get out from the ground. Otherwise, he would forever remain a potato that might be dug up and eaten. Thus, when the sun rose the next day and Lu Ji felt the first rays of sunlight on his leaves, he forcibly suppressed the urge to laze, transform into human form, and opened his eyes. The morning air had the unique scent of dew, and the temperature was low, giving a distinct chill, but this chill perfectly complemented the warmth of the morning sun. Lu Ji could not remember the last time he had greeted the morning as a human. He had almost forgotten this feeling. It felt really great, this distinctly human feeling. After digging out his lower hall from the ground, Lu Ji discovered that an old robe had been placed beside him. It appeared to be the robe he had gotten wet before, which had now since been dried and was likely left beside him by Yang. How thoughtful, but in the sort of place we are at, clothes aren't exactly a renewable resource. Lu Ji thought to himself as he put on the robe. His previous robe had been ripped to shreds when he transformed into the giant bear, his body expanding too quickly for the fabric to handle. Thinking back, Lu Ji realized that he had been helped back here by the young lady all while completely naked yesterday. His mind had been preoccupied with the image of dripping intestines and hadn't given any thought to his nudity at that moment, which was horrifically embarrassing in retrospect. No, he couldn't dwell on the events of yesterday any longer. Thinking about it would only bring back the image of those mangled intestines. That image was too visceral, and just the thought of it made his stomach churn. After putting on clothing, Lu Ji surveyed his surroundings, and then, he got a huge shock. He recalled having slept in the ground for only a day, yet the scenery around him had drastically changed from before. The surrounding weeds had been neatly trimmed, while scattered stones were neatly stacked, and in the middle of this cleared land stood a 2-story wooden house. Lu Ji had lived in an apartment all his human life and was rather unfamiliar with a construct like wooden houses. This might even be the first real wooden house he had ever seen. But there was one thing he was certain of. This kind of house couldn't possibly be built by 3 ordinary people in a day. Oh, right, those 3 aren't ordinary folk. Never mind. It was unfair to compare. Lu Ji could only struggle to survive in this wilderness as a potato, whereas they settled into a 2-story villa in just a day. It was still early, and since Lu Ji had come out at sunrise, the others, sleeping in a wooden house lacking glass windows and without alarm clocks or roosters, were probably still asleep. Lu Ji looked around and discovered that there was a new earth stove just to the side of the house. He went over and found a pile of wild potatoes, mushrooms, and other vegetables, likely gathered yesterday as food supplies. How convenient. Lu Ji was also feeling a tad hungry. Having buried himself on an empty stomach the day before, the small amount of energy from half a day's photosynthesis had been almost entirely depleted overnight. Now that the ingredients in the stove were ready, he could make breakfast for the 3. Well, I once aspired to go to New Oriental if I couldn't get into university, Lu Ji muttered as he rolled up his sleeves by the mud stove. While it's just breakfast, preparing 4 dishes and a soup shouldn't be too extravagant, right? TL note, New Oriental is a provider of private education services in China, with emphasis on online education. 2 figures, one tall and one short, were struggling through the desert. The taller one, actually wasn't very tall, roughly 1.6 meters in height, was shrouded in a brown robe and holding a beautiful white jade staff. However, this exquisitely crafted staff was currently being used as a walking stick, its end constantly jabbed into the rough sand and gravel. The shorter figure was truly short, no more than a meter tall, which was even shorter than most dwarves. Just that unlike the stocky and stout build of dwarves, this figure was petite and a tad round. Were Lu Ji here, he would probably think that this was a lullafell. Callie, we've been walking all night. I'm tired. A female voice, hoarse from dehydration, squeaked from beneath the shorter one's cloak. Shall we find a place to rest for a while? A similarly hoarse voice from the taller figure responded. Let me see, it looks like there are 2 seaberry trees ahead. We might be able to pick some seaberries for sustenance. Yes, this was the Calidora that a certain young swordsman was pinning for. Yeah, the shorter one replied, her gulping audible. The 2 staggered toward the distant seaberry trees. In this flat and barren desert, even if one could see a tree, one wouldn't know how long it would take to reach it. An hour, perhaps 2, sometimes even half a day's walk wouldn't be out of the question. But they didn't have a choice. Time was their most precious resource, and even the time for resting had to be utilized wisely. Fortunately, they could still hold on. After an indeterminate amount of time, when the 2 finally reached the seaberry trees, the shorter woman nearly collapsed face first. Thankfully, she managed to brace herself just before her face hit the ground. Giranini, are you okay? Calidora hurried over to help her. I'm okay, just somewhat tired, the short female by the name of Giranini replied, turning around to lean against one of the seaberry trees and sitting down. Ah, this is much better. Huff, that's good. Calidora breathed a sigh of relief as she sat down beside her companion. Ha, how embarrassing. I got tired before you did, Giranini muttered, and I'm supposed to be a warrior. This is the disadvantage of having short legs. What are you talking about? I don't even know if I'd still be alive without you around, Calidora said, rubbing Giranini's head gently. Now it's my turn to take care of you. While saying that, Calidora raised her staff and lightly tapped the tree behind her. In no time, like falling feathers, grape-like fruits came cascading down. These were sea berries, practically the only food that could be found in this desert. Rich in various vitamins and containing a fair amount of sugar, each tree would often have at least a single bunch. Just that its taste. Chapter 16.2. Why do I, as a potato, still have to study? Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Pitui, Giranini spat out the seaberry she had just put in her mouth and grimaced. It's so sour and bitter. Despite saying that, she stuffed the spat on seaberry on her hand back into her mouth. This was the desert of burials, where even the nastiest of food was a precious survival resource, too valuable to waste. Calidora watched her do this, truly feeling pity. She took out her waterskin from inside her robes and checked it thoroughly, just as she had checked countless times before. It was already empty. Giranini, give me your waterskin. Calidora reached out her hand. Oh, Giranini pulled out a similar waterskin from her own robes and handed it over. Calidora opened up both waterskins, picked up her staff, and started chanting an incantation. Gradually, during the incantation, a small droplet of water materialized out of thin air, growing and expanding until it was a sphere of transparent water the size of a basketball. This was a spell to condense the water element, and it was practically the only source of drinking water for the two in the desert. However, the desert was so dry that vapor was scarce to the extreme. It was often only near trees that Calidora could condense such a sphere of clean water. With a gentle wave of her staff, she carefully funneled the water into the two waterskins. Here, drink while you are eating. Calidora handed one of the waterskins to Giranini. Let's rest a bit longer. We should be able to refill the water once more. Really? That's wonderful. A slight smile finally appeared on Giranini's face. Being able to drink an entire bag of water in this sort of place was truly a blessing. Calidora sighed softly and took a sip from her own waterskin. Then, she also popped a small cluster of sea berries into her mouth, enduring the sourness as she chewed slowly. As she chewed, she pulled out a small disc. This was an ancient disc that looked like it was the lid of a certain something. Calidora gently caressed the disc, then imbued some magic into it. The disc lit up, however, it only glowed for a moment before flickering out again. It's still not working? Calidora was disappointed, slumping back against the trunk of the seaberry tree. Mervant, are you still safe right now? You, who don't know magic, better not die of thirst in this desert. Bear and mushroom soup, roasted bear with potatoes, stir-fried wild vegetables with bear, grilled bear with wild peppers, and a mixed stir-fry of wild vegetables. A total of 4 dishes in one soup, please enjoy. Luigi spread his arms, displaying the full table of his labor and smiling warmly as he introduced the dishes to the trio. Of course, they didn't understand a word, but that wasn't important. This was merely a ceremonial aspect. This lad, even though he's a potato, his cooking skills are quite impressive, Mervant muttered in surprise after seeing the dishes on the table. These dishes almost rival those made by Callie. Can't you leave out the even though he's a potato part? Yang gave him a pointed look while casually slapping away Osar's hand that was sneakily reaching out for the food. Osar scratched his head in frustration, glanced at the chopsticks Yang held, sighed, and picked up his own chopsticks to start learning how to use them. He had no choice. He wouldn't get to eat if he didn't learn. They had survived on sour fruits in the desert for days, and now with such a lavish meal laid out, Osar was not about to just sit there and watch. And as Yang had said, as an elite martial artist skilled in various hand techniques and grappling, Osar's finger dexterity was naturally much higher than average, so learning to use chopsticks wasn't really a challenge for him. The same was true for Mervant, a swordsman. It didn't take long for these two to grasp the usage of this new utensil, and they thoroughly enjoyed the feast thereafter. Culinary culture is complex, with every region in the world having its own, often influenced by a multitude of factors, resulting in differences with each other. And the greater the regional discrepancies, the greater the difference, as the discrepancy being a whole other world. Neither Mervant nor Osar had ever tasted dishes prepared with these cooking techniques before. Of course, given the limited conditions and condiments, the food might have been considered mediocre to any random takeout place in Luigi's former world. But for this bunch, who had just emerged from an arduous journey 2 days ago, this meal was absolutely delightful. It was the same for Luigi. He didn't know how many years he had gone without food for, and while preparing the dishes, he couldn't help sneaking a few bites. Now that he could eat freely, he certainly wasn't going to hold back. And with his experience and skill with chopsticks, he was the most proficient at the table. It would be rather embarrassing if he couldn't beat the others in snagging meat. Like a whirlwind sweeping through the table, the 4 of them had cleaned up a hearty spread of 4 dishes and 1 soup in just 20 minutes, with not even a single drop of soup left. Ah, satisfying, Osar exhaled, slumping into his chair and contentedly rubbing his slightly bloated stomach. This lad's cooking is really good. Looks like we won't have to worry about Yang's dark cuisine anymore. TL note, dark cuisine is a neologism for bizarre and weird food or combinations that sound bizarre or disgusting but are often tastier than anticipated. I apologize that I can only make dark cuisine. Yang's lips twitched, unlike a certain two who can only boil and roast awkwardly. I wonder where they get the confidence to criticize others. Hey, I didn't say anything. Don't drag me into it. Mervant rapped his fist on the table in protest. Watching the 3 bickering back and forth, Luigi felt envious. They were all sitting at the same table, yet he was the only one who couldn't understand the others. This made him feel as though he belonged under the table, and it didn't feel good. I really need to learn the language first. Luigi looked at Yang, wanting to express his eagerness to study hard, but even after pondering, he didn't know how to convey his sentiment. But soon, Luigi realized his dilemma was unnecessary. Yang had already packed his schedule full without him having to say a word. Seeing the dense list of incantations he needed to memorize, Luigi felt as if he had returned to his previous life, back to the days of studying for language proficiency tests. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 17. Stone, but not entirely. Incantations were very fascinating. As long as one knew the pronunciation and kept reciting them, the person could very quickly grasp their meanings. This understanding came from the inside, an internal realization, so once comprehended, the person could naturally remember the corresponding spells. Luigi used to dread memorization, whether it was English vocabulary or geographical maps. Such things had been nightmares of his during his student days. So, when he saw those thick pages of today's homework, he actually felt despair. However, when he started learning word by word, he didn't feel at all tired. The whole process involved just sitting with Yang on the crisp grass, enjoying sunlight and the breeze while reciting each challenging syllable one by one. The only less than perfect aspect, well, it was probably having his right hand still tied to the pole, his index finger pointed to the side. Not too far away, Mervant was busy with some carpentry work. Although they had already built a house yesterday, it was only the basic structure that was constructed. Last night, the 3 of them had simply laid some cypress leaves on the floor and made do with them as beds. Yesterday, Yang's familiars had finished processing the entire bear hide, which was now stretched and drying on a rack. Once it was completely air-dried, the warm fur would be perfect for use as mattresses. Thus, Mervant was preparing to build some simple wooden beds and lay the bear fur over so that they could avoid sleeping on the floor. Meanwhile, Osar had gone out to forage in the woods. While they had a large amount of frozen bear meat, it would be too monotonous without variety. Therefore, tubers, mushrooms, and other wild vegetables had to be gathered. If he was lucky, perhaps he might even find some ripe wild fruits. The ingredients Luigi used for breakfast were what Osar had gathered on his foraging run yesterday. Everyone was busy with their own tasks, and it was only when the sun was high in the sky that Luigi realized that the morning had passed without him noticing. Lunch, Luigi muttered subconsciously. Hungry? Yang asked. A little, huh? Luigi was stunned for a moment. Something was off. Had they just been conversing? Could it be that he had? Oh, right, he had been speaking using incantations. After reciting incantations all morning, it had just slipped out naturally. Seeing Lu Ji staring at her blankly, Yang smiled and asked, "Cook, now?" Lu Ji's eyes widened even more. "I understand. I really understand it." Even though it was basic communication of single words pieced together, he truly understood. Finally, he had spoken with someone else. What's wrong?" Yang stared at Lu Ji strangely, and pointed to the corner of his eye. "Huh? Lu Ji paused, reaching his fingers up to his eye. To his surprise, he had been so moved he had started to cry. Lu Ji quickly rubbed his eyes and said hurriedly, "I cook. I cook." With that, he attempted to stand up but completely forgot that his right hand was still tied to the pole. His center of gravity shifted, and he spun 180 degrees around the pole and landed flat on the ground. Peeved, Yang couldn't hold back and burst out laughing. Lu Ji's face flushed with embarrassment, fumbling as he hurriedly untied his hand, then scrambled up from the ground and ran toward the stove as if fleeing. Yang shook her head while chuckling, then took out a pen, flipped to the back of her notebook, and continued to write something. She was right. Lu Ji was indeed well suited for learning incantations. His comprehension of incantations was remarkably quick. Yang hadn't originally expected Lu Ji to complete the number of single-syllable characters she had prepared for today, but it seemed her expectations might have been too conservative. Nearby, Mervyn leaned against a finished wooden bed, watching Lu Ji and Yang's interaction with interest. It's rare to see Yang laugh, he thought to himself. Ever since that incident, it seems like she hasn't laughed in a long time, even when Osar tries to be funny around her. His gaze turned to Lu Ji, carefully scrutinizing this strange green-haired potato man. I really don't know what's so special about this guy, though it sounds strange to say, when thinking about it, he's as special as they come. Maybe I can actually let my guard down around him. After all, he's helped us before. But very quickly, he still shook his head, dismissing the thought. Lu Ji was just too peculiar and shrouded in too many mysteries. Without complete understanding, it was really difficult to trust someone wholeheartedly. I'll keep an eye on him still, thought Mervyn, but, perhaps I should be nicer to him? No, wait damn it, when have I not been nice? After resting for an entire morning, eating their fill, and preparing enough water supplies, Kalidora and Giranini once again set out on their journey toward the end of the desert. This desert, however, seemed boundless, stretching out endlessly with no visible borders in sight. "Callie, I often find myself wondering, have we really not gone off course?" Giranini said softly. Having just hydrated, they now had a bit of energy to chat. Even so, they always spoke in the lowest voice possible within audible range to conserve energy and the moisture in their throats. "Maybe we are off course, or maybe we aren't, who knows?" Kalidora shook her head slightly, but regardless, we have to believe that we are on the right path. "It sounds like we're gambling with our lives," Giranini muttered, but then again, stepping into this desert was a gamble to begin with. "Yes, but what's more despairing is that even this desert that devours people likely won't stop the tyrant." Kalidora sighed softly. "But it can delay him for a long time," Giranini added. "At least it can hold up his cumbersome army, though if his two were to run into a squad, we'd probably be doomed." "No, our luck can't be that bad. I remember hearing that squads in the desert are rare, and their main mission is supposed to be searching for something here," Kalidora responded. "It's said the tyrant doesn't hold much hope, so there haven't been many squads dispatched here. It's just that no one knows exactly what they are searching for." Giranini shrugged. "I've heard many stories of brave adventurers venturing here in search of treasures, but it seems none of them end well. The tyrant clearly doesn't care what happens to those squads he sends." Kalidora shook her head, "But I think we should talk less. I'm already feeling thirsty." Agreed." Giranini turned her gaze back to the front and suddenly her eyes widened. "Wait, what is that?" "Huh? What are you talking about?" Kalidora followed Giranini's gaze and was immediately taken aback. "What in the world? How can there be a city in this desert? Is it a mirage?" "No, it's not. There really is a town there, and there are people standing at the city gates." Giranini's eyes gleamed red as she focused intently on the large structures that seemed to appear out of nowhere. "And those people at the gates look like they are made of stone." "Stone statues?" Kalidora asked, puzzled. "They are stone statues, but not entirely," Giranini muttered. "Those statues seem alive. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin." Published by Ranobes. Chapter 18.1. Lonely Old Potato. Lu Ji felt somewhat ambivalent as he watched the wild peppers simmering in the pot. Truth be told, he had already experienced these mixed feelings when he cooked wild potatoes, but at that time, it was only directed toward the potatoes. Having been a potato for so many years, perhaps he had developed some sentimental feelings toward potatoes, so it wasn't out of the ordinary to feel this way. But now, Lu Ji realized he was wrong. Since the meal in the morning, he was aware that he could transform into many more things. It seemed that the various wild vegetables he had eaten in the morning had been added to that list. And then, this ambivalence came. When chopping up these vegetables, he felt a mysterious twinge of phantom pain. And it was only toward vegetables. He felt absolutely nothing when chopping up bare flesh. Could it be that I've been a potato for too long and have started to develop a sense of belonging and empathy toward plants? Lu Ji couldn't help himself from speculating. That would be absurd. After covering the pot, Lu Ji turned around, about to go do something else, and got a fright. Osar had returned at some point and had been standing just a step behind. Lu Ji had nearly bumped into him when turning around. Osar realized his intrusion and quickly stepped back, flashing Lu Ji an apologetic grin, and then lifted the basket in his hand. Lu Ji glanced over and saw that it was filled with wild vegetables and mushrooms. The leftovers from yesterday's foraging were almost used up, and this timely supply would be a perfect addition to the bear stew. Taking the basket of vegetables, Lu Ji smiled at Osar and turned to wash the vegetables, picking out some suitable ones to throw into the pot. But as he washed the vegetables, he noticed that Osar hadn't left. Instead, the tiger man continued to stand behind him, watching curiously as the food was being prepared. Lu Ji pondered for a moment and asked, "You hungry?" Osar scratched his head, then glanced over at Yang a short distance away. The latter, however, was busy preparing lessons and didn't look their way. Osar scratched his chin, then flashed Lu Ji an awkward grin. Yes, Lu Ji had spoken in incantations, and Osar had heard the incantations that Lu Ji had spoken, but Osar didn't understand incantations. It wouldn't just be Osar. Mervyn, too, didn't understand them. The only one among the three who understood incantations was Yang. Seeing Osar shrug awkwardly, Lu Ji came to a realization. Incantations were basically a language of magic and spells, so it was normal for Osar, a brawler, not to understand it. But standing here all this while can only mean he must be hungry, right? At that thought, Lu Ji quickly washed the vegetables and tossed them into the pot. Fortunately, the meal was almost ready. Once the stew in the pot was done, he could. Bomb. A loud noise echoed. Lu Ji's hand trembled, and the pot lid nearly flew out of his hand. He turned around, only to see that Mervyn had inexplicably smashed a half-constructed chair to pieces with his hammer. Then, as if suddenly panicking, Mervyn began fumbling around his collar and hurriedly fished out an old-looking disc. He stared blankly at the disc, quickly wiped it several times, and kept shaking his head, muttering, "No, no, 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 no," all the while rubbing the disc as if trying to get it to start a fire. Lu Ji watched Mervyn's strange behavior in bewilderment, then turned toward Osar beside him, noticing that Osar's face had darkened. The latter had furrowed brows and a gloomy expression. Lu Ji then looked toward Yang and discovered that she had put down her notebook and strode over to Mervyn's side. She snatched away the disc in his hand and closed her eyes. In the next moment, the disc lit up with a burst of white light, but it quickly faded away. "Yang, Callie, something has happened to Callie," Mervyn exclaimed, grabbing Yang's shoulders and shaking her. "She must have run into something. We have to go find her. We have to rescue her." However, Yang briskly removed Mervyn's hands from her shoulders and slapped him sharply across the face with a quick double-handed smack. This action happened so fast and unexpected that it left Lu Ji staring in astonishment. But as far as the results were concerned, it seemed quite effective. Whether he was stunned or something else, Mervyn did calm down. Calm down, Mervant. This thing hasn't shattered yet, Yang said, pushing the disc back into his chest. While I don't know why it lost its link, as long as it hasn't shattered, it means Callie is definitely still alive. I know, but Mervant wanted to say something more, but Yang cut him off with a raised hand. I know what you want to say, and yes, this isn't normal. Yang sighed. After a moment of silence, she added, all right, let's all get ready. It looks like we have to head back to that damn place once again. In the barren desert, Calidora and Giranini were hiding behind a sand dune, quietly observing the bizarre ancient city that had suddenly appeared before them. Do we really have to go in? Calidora whispered. This place is too strange. Ever since we got close, I haven't been able to feel my connection with Mervant. I know there's something odd about this place. Giranini turned to her. But Callie, you ought to already know that even though I'm not very lucky, I'm one who doesn't like leaving my fate up to luck. Like you said, we've walked for so long that we no longer know if we're even going in the right direction, Giranini continued. But if we can find some clues in this city, that, in my view, is much better than stubbornly following one path as if we're betting our lives on it. All right, perhaps you were right, Calidora sighed. Although she had always been the one to forge ahead and continually assured Giranini that they could only move forward in that direction, her own unease was no less than her companions. She constantly worried, what if they were wrong? What if they were just walking around and around in circles? What if this desert never ended? What if she never saw Mervant again? She truly didn't know. She had always been encouraging Giranini on, but no one was there to encourage herself. She could only clutch the disc tightly, sensing that link which sustained her will to continuously move forward. But ever since stepping into the vicinity of this strange ancient city, she suddenly couldn't sense that link. For a moment, she thought something had happened to Mervant but soon realized this wasn't the case. As a practitioner of holy arts, she also had knowledge of barriers, illusions, and the like. She could sense that they had stepped into a place that isolated all connection with the outside world. She had never heard of such a place in the desert of burials and couldn't understand why such a grand, decrepit city would have been constructed in this vast, barren expanse. However, venturing into the city, even if it might be dangerous, was infinitely better than wandering in the endless, uncertain desert. But what exactly should we do? Just go straight in? Giranini, peeking over the dune, whispered, even though that guard seems to be a statue, like the ordinary sort placed by the sides of gates. Do you think they could be some kind of race unique to the desert? If it were a normal city, we'd observe how others enter, but... Calidora looked around helplessly. Clearly, there's no one here but us. Then let's just go straight through the front. Giranini stood up, dusting off the sand from her body. We'll just test the waters a bit, and if something feels off, we just run. If we try to sneak over the city walls, we might provoke an attack instead. Having said that, she stepped around the dune and slid down the dune slope, headed toward the city. Hey, wait, Giranini, Calidora complained helplessly but also scrambled around the dune and followed after. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 18.2. Lonely Old Potato. Lu Ji was at a loss. He had just prepared a whole table of dishes and was ready to eat when Yang and the others started packing up. They prepared a heap of water skins, cut off more than half of the frozen bear meat, and even chopped some firewood, which they all stuffed into Yang's magically conjured space. The way Yang reached her foot into the space to kick inside before finally sealing it indicated that the entire space was packed fully. At first, Lu Ji thought they were moving house. He even wondered why they would move since they had just built the house. But seeing that they didn't pack anything from outside, instead moving the stuff into the house, Lu Ji realized that this wasn't moving but preparing for a long journey. Still, Lu Ji was puzzled. He didn't know what could have happened to make the three so anxious to leave that they would even skip the prepared meal. Seeing that the three seemed almost done packing, Lu Ji hurried over to Yang and cobbled together a question with his limited vocabulary. Yang took a moment to think and responded within the range of vocabulary Lu Ji could understand, using just a few words: we, friend, danger, search, you, here, wait. The meaning was clear, and Lu Ji understood it. Just that. He eyed the table full of dishes he had prepared. The thought of sitting there alone, slowly picking at the food all by himself, filled Lu Ji with a sense of desolation. Such a pitiful, lonely old potato. He was pensive for a moment, then made some gestures. I, search, your, we. Since he didn't know how to express, go together, Lu Ji's words came out rather incoherent. Of course, Yang could understand what he meant. However, she didn't wish to let Lu Ji follow them. Lu Ji didn't understand how treacherous the environment of that place was, and even with her magical space filled to the brim, Yang still felt uncertain of entering that lifeless zone. Sighing, Yang pondered for a moment, then recited a short incantation. Raising her hand, she lightly flicked Lu Ji's forehead. In the next instant, Lu Ji's vision was engulfed in a blood-red hue, and he saw again his own furry bear paw and the intestines slowly dripping off it. It was an almost instantaneous physiological reaction. Lu Ji felt his stomach churn, and he hurriedly covered his mouth with his hand. He looked at Yang with confusion, not understanding why she wanted him to recall that bloody and nauseating image again. Yang didn't say anything. She simply smiled at Lu Ji, then tiptoed up and gently ruffled his hair. Then, she turned around and asked Osar and Mervant, you guys ready? Then let's go. With that, she led the way into the forest. Mervant turned to look at Lu Ji, his mouth opening as if he wanted to say something, but ultimately he remained silent and followed after Yang. Osar smiled at Lu Ji, giving him a firm pat on his shoulder, then a thumbs up before jogging off to catch up with the others. Lu Ji stood motionless for a long time as he watched the three walk away. Finally letting the hand held to his mouth fall, he breathed deeply, finally managing to suppress the nausea. Actually, the message Yang wanted to convey wasn't hard to understand. Lu Ji didn't have to think very long to get it. Don't follow them if I don't want to see that kind of scene again, huh? That's probably what she meant, Lu Ji said with a self-deprecating chuckle. Really, what in the world is going on? He had thought this was just a typical sword and magic otherworld, where birds chirped and flowers bloomed. He had assumed it was just bad luck that he happened to be lost and trapped in the wilderness, and now that he had met others, his joyful adventure in this new world should have begun. However, this didn't seem to be the case. Deep down, Lu Ji really wanted to follow them, but his legs just wouldn't move. Perhaps it was fear, disgust, or an instinctive belief that he shouldn't step into such a world, or maybe it was simply the fear of becoming a burden. Of course, it was likely to be a culmination of all of these. Just the thought of those bloody scenes reappearing, possibly several times, made his feet feel as though massive rocks were tied to them. Lu Ji sighed deeply, reluctantly slinking back to the house and sitting at the table. However, despite seeing the table full of dishes, he wasn't able to muster even a bit of appetite. Lu Ji was confused. He didn't know if he genuinely wanted to tag along and help, or if he just didn't want to be left alone here. If it was the latter, wouldn't it be too capricious to insist on following them? Besides, they were so capable, they didn't really need him. Perhaps having him stay here to keep watch on the house was the right choice. But what if the situation from before happened again? They might be capable, but they weren't invincible, just like the previous time, if Lu Ji hadn't been there. If Lu Ji hadn't been there, well, things might not necessarily have gone wrong. He didn't know if Yang didn't have any backup plans or if she had merely been drawing the enemy into a trap. Moreover, he didn't know if he could act as decisively as he did last time. He feared that if he recalled those images, he might freeze in place. If his hesitation in a fight caused a disaster, wouldn't that be even worse? Indeed, I should just stay here. This must be the best solution, Lu Ji said to himself. See, there are so many dishes, all freshly made by me, still warm and definitely delicious. Telling himself all that, he picked up a piece of bear meat with his chopsticks and put it in his mouth. It's tasty indeed, Lu Ji smiled as he chewed. And chewed. And chewed. It's tasteless. Ha. His sigh echoed in this silent camp. Lu Ji didn't notice that in the nearby woods, several pairs of eyes were watching him. Vaguely, there was the sound of saliva being swallowed too. Chapter 19.1. Who says potatoes can't eat? Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Atop the cliff, Mervyn clutched the disc, trying to sense the direction of the link. Nearby, Osar sneakily approached Yane and asked, Yane, if I start learning incantations now, how long do you think it will take me to learn them? Why are you thinking of learning incantations now? Yane eyed him skeptically. Plus, when you say learn, just what degree of proficiency do you mean? You're teaching that potato lad incantations, right? Osar said. I think he's rather interesting, so I was wondering if I could also learn a little and maybe chat with him in the future. Oh, you want to use it for conversation? Yane sized up Osar and said reluctantly, forgive my bluntness, but that might be difficult. I know incantations are difficult, Osar replied, but we have quite a bit of time here, so why don't you spare some time to teach me? No, I'm not saying that incantations are difficult. I'm saying that you might be a bit lacking in talent. Yane shrugged. Your race generally has very poor magical talent. Why do you think there haven't been many high-level mages among your people over the years? That. Osar was momentarily at a loss for words and, after a while, said with resignation, yeah, that does seem to be the case, huh? But why do you want to chat with him? Yane inquired. How should I put it? I just feel like he's a good lad. Osar shrugged. We've just met, and he's already cooking meals for us. Plus his muscles aren't bad, and he even helped us in a fight. He's such a good guy. Wouldn't it be a shame if we couldn't even have a conversation with him? Oh, you think so highly of him? Yane was somewhat surprised. All right, I guess. Probably not as highly as you think of him, Osar joked. Me? Yane was first stunned, then the image of Lu Ji kicking the tyrant's scalp flashed through her mind. After a long pause, she nodded. Indeed, you were right, he is a good lad. So, perhaps we shouldn't have left him back there to keep watch? Osar said. He seemed like he really didn't want to be left alone. Oh, that. Yane turned to look toward the nearby forest. Well, actually, that might not be the case. Might not? Osar asked, puzzled. What do you mean, might not? I never said that he couldn't come with us, Yane said. Whether he comes or not is up to him. Is that so? Osar scratched his head. Yes, although I really didn't want him to come along and brave the dangers, it seems like he has already arrived. Yane sighed. Osar was taken aback and instinctively turned back to look in the direction where they had come. Indeed, he spotted Lu Ji. Currently, the latter was pressed against a tree trunk, gasping for breath as he waved and flashed them a goofy smile. Kalidora and Giranini were walking along the ancient city's main street. That's right, they had successfully entered, and it went rather smoothly. The gatekeeper did not speak to them but neither hindered their entry nor showed any sign of wariness. They were just allowed in. Initially, Kalidora was suspicious about the ease of their entry, but Giranini was bolder. She waved her hand in front of the gatekeeper and, seeing no reaction, entered the city without a second thought. Kalidora had no choice and could only hurriedly follow after. Upon entering the city, Kalidora immediately felt a strong sense of disconnection, although she had already sensed that the space here seemed to be isolated from the outside world. That sensation was more intensified than ever inside. She could sense that the city was enveloped in a remarkably powerful barrier, even stronger than the final defensive barrier of the Dragon City of old. But what was strange was that Kalidora couldn't discern the purpose of this barrier. She could sense it had a function to isolate, but merely hiding seemed unreasonable since the entire city was clearly visible from the outside. Even more peculiar than the mysterious barrier was the strange scenery on the city streets. At first glance, apart from the residents looking like stone sculptures, the streets were no different from the commercial streets of bustling cities they had known. As they walked, the two occasionally received curious glances from passers-by, if these eyes could indeed see. But a closer observation revealed anomalies. First was sound. There were no voices in the city, only the heavy footsteps of stone beings moving about. Of course, this could just be because these beings of an unknown race did not speak but instead had their own unique way of communication. However, the strange thing was that whether it was the street vendors or those in restaurants by the sides of the streets, these beings seemed to be talking to each other as if using spoken language, their mouths moving but without any sound. Even if this phenomenon was explained as lip reading, what was even more bizarre was the merchandise sold by the vendors in restaurants. The vendor stalls varied widely, selling decorations, clothes, toys, and various tools. But whatever it was, all the items were made of stone. Yes, including clothes. Could stone clothes be worn? Bluntly speaking, even if they could be worn, these things shouldn't be called clothes but torture racks instead. Yet, strangely, these people still bought them. After purchasing, they didn't wear these clothes, and just carried them away. And mentioning that, these stone people were very hard, with clear fractures at the joints, making their movements somewhat stiff. The currency used to make purchases was also made of stone. Even if these could hardly be explained as a unique racial culture, there were some aspects that Kalidora just couldn't understand. That was the food vendors in the street-side restaurants. As expected, what they sold was all stone. Yes, stone eating stone. It made sense, probably. But the problem was, these stone people didn't actually eat it. They just placed it near their mouths for show, much like children pretending to eat mud pies while playing house. Everything seemed like an imitation of a typical human city and not a cityscape that should naturally emerge from this stone race. Giranini, I feel something is off here, Kalidora whispered. Can you smell anything? Why do you make it sound like I'm a guard dog? Giranini's mouth twitched. But you're right, something is off. There's a very strange scent, and it even makes me shiver a bit. Dear lady, if you're referring to the odor on me, well, now that I think about it, it hasn't been many years since I bathed. Perhaps that's what amused you. Giranini and Kalidora simultaneously turned around. Behind them stood a man with a genial smile. The man's skin was ash white, much like the appearance of granite. He wore a thick white robe, exposing one arm and half of his chest, seemingly unconcerned by the harsh desert sun. His hair was long and snow white, shimmering like crystalline glass under the sunlight. In his hand, he held a staff intricately carved from flowing crystal. Kalidora had seen countless high-end staffs in her lifetime, some forged from the finest materials in the world, others meticulously crafted by master artisans, and some combining both aspects. But all those staffs she had once marveled at paled in comparison to this one. Giranini couldn't help gulping nervously before asking, who are you? Arriving uninvited at someone's home and not even knowing who the host is, said the smiling man. Ladies, that is somewhat discourteous. Apologies, we didn't know. Kalidora quickly stepped forward. No, it's fine, actually. If you did know who I am, I wouldn't welcome you here, the man said, walking slowly between them, then turning his head and nodding. Come with me. You girls haven't had anything decent to eat along the way, have you? How would you like to have a whole roasted lamb? Chapter 19.2. Who says potatoes can't eat? Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. At the side of the empty house in the woods, Lu Ji's freshly prepared table of food was still hot. Rustle, rustle. The bushes shook. Something was hiding within, concealed behind the leaves. It seemed to be deliberately making noise, as if testing the waters. Perhaps it was worried that there might still be someone inside the house. But evidently, such worries were superfluous. Since Lu Ji had followed the trio and left, all that remained was an empty house, the frozen half-corpse of a bear, and a table full of steaming dishes. Rustle, rustle. The bushes continued to shake, the noise got louder. Finally, having seemingly confirmed that there really was no one around, the noise at last stopped. Then, a bunch of round, potato-like creatures, or rather, potato people, burst out from the woods. They were less than a meter tall, with noses and eyes, topped with green shoots, and thin limbs, or rather, roots that resembled limbs. Due to their rounded shapes and thin limbs, their rolling and scrambling run seemed somewhat comical. As soon as they burst out, the potato people headed straight for the hot meals on the table, grabbing the food and broth in a scramble, smearing it on their hands, feet, or bodies. None of it went to their mouths. However, if observed closely, the food and broth smeared on their bodies seemed to be slowly absorbed by their skin. Perhaps, this was their unique way of eating? While it looked messy and most would find it hard to accept, they actually managed to eat cleaner than humans. Even the food that fell on the ground or the broth that dripped into the soil was completely absorbed by them. As a result, after about a half hour of frenzied activity, not one bit of the lavish spread was wasted. All of it was absorbed by the potato people. Then, seemingly having their fill and thoroughly satisfied, the bunch of potatoes rolled onto the grass in front of the wooden house, sprawling out joyfully. Soon after, they began to dig holes right there. A while later, the potato people had buried themselves completely in the soil, leaving only their leafy shoots swaying in the wind. Under a seaberry tree in the barren desert, a squad clad in light brown uniforms and orange capes stood around. A scout wielding a curved dagger was perched on the tall seaberry tree, checking the branches above. Then, he grabbed a small broken branch and jumped down. The branch, which should have been laden with seaberry fruits, was now bare, and the break was very fresh. The squad members exchanged glances. Though no words were spoken, they spread out and began digging in the nearby sand. At first, they found nothing, but undeterred, they expanded the range and depth of the excavation. However, they still found nothing, yet they remained unconcerned. Since this was the case, they expanded their scope once again. Eventually, after relentless effort by these 12, they uncovered a seaberry branch buried under the sand several hundred meters away from the seaberry tree. The squad member with a casting staff stepped forward and picked up the dried-up branch. Then, his eyes widened. A strange magical array flickered before him, and a faint aura emerged from the branch. This aura wavered slightly and slowly rose. He stared at the aura, holding his breath and watching intently. A long time passed, but that aura remained unchanged. However, he was patient. Since there were no changes, he would continue to wait. And wait. And wait. Finally, the aura swayed slightly in a certain direction, moving just a few millimeters. This extremely subtle fluctuation did not escape his notice. He looked in that direction, where nothing but the vast desert stretched to the horizon, as if the slight movement had merely been an anomaly caused by the flow of air. But he seemed to think otherwise, or perhaps he did not care. They had been wandering in this desert for an indeterminate amount of time, and any piece of useful information, any vague direction that they could get a hint of, was like blood to a shark. They would pursue it relentlessly. Thus, he extended a hand in that direction. In the next moment, the entire squad moved in unison. Not a word was said, nor a glance exchanged, but all 12 started to trudge in the designated direction. Meanwhile, on the other side of the desert, another small group was tracking a faint trace that had led into the desert. Only a short while ago, Mervin's disc had completely lost its faint link with Calidora. Unease from losing this link made Mervin distraught, but it was at that moment of disconnection that he successfully tracked a direction, a vague one. For Mervin, this was like catching the glimpse light of a lighthouse while adrift in a vast and dark sea. If not for the last bit of rationality telling him that sprinting full force across the desert was tantamount to a death wish, he might have already dashed off in that direction. Even now, his brisk pace had put a significant distance between him and the rest of his group. Please be safe, Callie, he prayed continuously as he walked swiftly, deeper into the desert. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 20.1, Hold It In. Luigi was a little worried. Considering how hot the weather was, he couldn't help thinking about the table full of food he had just left out on the table in the open. If we don't take long, perhaps the food might just be stale. But if this trip takes a long time, the whole table might turn moldy. But, if the birds come, wouldn't they leave behind a lot of droppings? I wonder if there is any spell to conveniently clean up bird droppings. Just as Luigi was lost in his habitual inner thoughts, he felt a poke on his face. Turning his head, he saw Yane looking at him, her brows furrowed as if somewhat worried. Upon getting Luigi's attention, she gestured slightly and asked how his body was doing using words he could understand. After all, it was dry and scorching in the desert, and she was concerned that Luigi might not cope well. Luigi didn't feel anything out of the ordinary and gestured to let Yane know he was fine and that she didn't need to worry about him. He wasn't pretending to be tough, he really felt fine. Although the sun was intense, for some reason, he felt very comfortable when the hot sun shone on his hair. As if he was undergoing photosynthesis. Whoa, could there really be chlorophyll in my hair? Speaking of which, Osar suddenly spoke up. Yane, we're losing sight of Mervin's dust trail. Is that really okay? If you're worried, you can go catch up to him. Yane shrugged, but if I were to go at his speed, you would probably have to carry me after a while. That's true. Osar scratched his head, glanced at Luigi, and, as if suddenly remembering something, said, oh, right. Doesn't this lad turn into a bear? How about having him transform into a bear and carry us? Having a person be a mount? That's rather disrespectful. Yane's mouth twitched, and even if he didn't mind, did you think a bear is a camel? Bears are large and furry. He'd overheat and pass out before long in this desert. Oh, that makes sense. Osar stroked his chin. All right, less talking. I'm already feeling a little parched, said Yane, raising her water skin and taking a sip, which she kept in her mouth. This method used the least water to keep the mouth moist as long as possible. When she had had her sip, she passed the water skin to Luigi, indicating that he should also take a sip. Luigi noticed her slightly pursed lips and understood, mimicking her by taking a small sip and holding the water in his mouth. Osar, on the other hand, was a bit awkward since his mouth structure was different from humans, making it hard for him to hold water. So Yane poured some water out and froze it into a small chunk of ice for him to hold in his mouth. Luigi felt a twinge of envy seeing this. He really missed the feeling of eating ice pops right now. It would be great if I could learn some ice magic when we get back, Luigi thought to himself. Even though I have no idea how to make ice cream, I could at least make some shaved ice. Fresh melon shaved ice, please enjoy. The man with ash-white skin smiled as he placed 2 cups of shaved ice before Calidora and Giranini. The whole roast lamb is in the oven, but it will take some time, so please enjoy some dessert first. Aw, thank you. Calidora gave a smile of gratitude. Who exactly are you? Oh, I haven't introduced myself yet. How rude of me, the man said, pulling up a chair to sit across from them. My name is Miza, and I am the lord of the city. The lord of a city in the desert? Giranini asked. Yes, a lord of a city in the desert. The man who called himself Miza nodded. Is that surprising? More strange than surprising, Giranini muttered. After all, it's the desert of burials we are talking about. Yes, it's called the desert of burials now. Miza leaned back in his chair, sighing. Actually, a long, long time ago, this place was also a rich and beautiful land. How long ago was that? Giranini pursed her lips. It must have been thousands of years ago, right? Thousands of years? Oh, perhaps, haha. Miza rubbed his nose. I didn't really keep track. So, it's been this long, huh? Hearing Miza say this, the other two exchanged astonished glances. Did it mean that the man before them had lived for several thousand years? Even the longest lived of the rock turtle race had lifespans of only a little over 1,000 years. Noticing their astonishment, Miza just smiled, seemingly uninterested in explaining further. Instead, he asked, so, why did you decide to venture into this desert? You must know that almost no one who enters here comes out alive. While that is the case, it's still a little unsettling to hear you say that, Giranini muttered to herself. Calidora shot her a wry look before saying, actually, we're well aware of the dangers here, but we had no other choice but to take the risk and cross the desert. Are you ladies being hunted or something? Miza leaned forward, seemingly interested. If that were the case, if it were me, I'd probably just duke it out with them. If there was even the slightest chance, we probably would do so, too. Calidora sighed helplessly. Mr. Miza, have you always stayed here? In this ancient city within the desert? That's right, Miza nodded, and you might have guessed it by now, I've been here for thousands of years. Despite their speculations, hearing it confirmed directly from Miza himself shocked the two ladies. You must be curious as to how I can live for so long, right? Miza was slightly amused seeing their astonished expressions. Actually, every visitor who happens to come here is curious at first. Many of them don't believe me, but Miza gestured toward a spot nearby where several neatly arranged, exquisitely crafted tombstones stood in the sand. Sooner or later, they will all come to believe, he continued, because they witnessed my immortality with their own lives. A chilling silence fell after he said that, causing the hairs on their necks to stand on end. Calidora's eyes darted uncertainly between Miza and the nearby tombstones, while Giranini's eyes emitted a faint red glow. Miza observed, staying completely silent. The silence continued. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 20.2, Hold It In. Calidora and Giranini both froze, their heads filled with question marks as they watched the now chuckling Miza. Haha, my apologies, it's a bad habit of mine. Every time new guests arrive, I can't help but scare them a little, Miza confessed as he walked toward the graveyard, gently brushing his palms over the tombstones. Some buried here died of illnesses or didn't survive their injuries that they carried here. The rest died naturally, having reached the end of their life cycles. You were saying, Calidora blinked several times, that they died of old age here? Yes, they were all my friends, Miza explained. Although this desert is considered a lifeless zone, there are always some unfortunate souls who, for various reasons, are forced to enter here. Of course, the majority are devoured by the desert, but there are always a few lucky ones who end up here. And then they never want to leave, especially because there's shaved ice here, Giranini jested, shaking the cup of shaved ice in front of her. You know, I was dreaming of shaved ice every single minute while walking through the desert, though your earlier scare has made me a little hesitant to eat it now. I apologize for that. Please, go ahead and eat. I didn't put anything weird in it. Miza laughed heartily. If I wanted to take pleasure in harming others, why would I choose to do it in the middle of this godforsaken desert? That makes sense, Giranini nodded, then eagerly scooped up a spoonful of shaved ice into her mouth. Having been trekking through the desert on foot for 2 whole months, she had craved for shaved ice desperately. Calidora glanced at her companion in resignation, she herself not intending to touch the spoon yet. She asked, I can understand why they wouldn't want to leave, but Mr. Miza, why don't you want to leave? Me? Oh, I have no reason to leave. It's because I belong here, and I ought to stay here, Miza said with a smile. You belong here? Calidora asked. Yes, I can only tell you that I belong here. Miza stroked his chin. As for the details, well, that's a long story, and I'm not really in the mood to tell it right now. Sorry, it was impertinent of me to ask. Calidora scratched her cheek sheepishly. No harm done. Just as you're curious about me, it's natural for me to be curious about you, Miza said. Maybe when I feel like it, I'll tell you about my past. Is there anything else you ladies like to ask? I'll need to check on our roast lamb soon. There's one more thing, Calidora responded at once. Why do you take such good care of strangers who arrive here? Ha ha ha, I've been asked that question many times. Miza laughed heartily. The answer is simple. Being alone in this desolate desert city is just too boring. Alone? Giranini, with her mouth full of shaved ice, asked. So those stone beings outside aren't people? You think they look like people? Miza's eyes lit up. That's quite the compliment, thank you. Actually, those are golems I created. Golems? A city of golems? Calidora was taken aback. My goodness, how long did that take? Her strong reaction was well understandable. Golems belonged under the category of familiars, and making or summoning them was an extremely complex process. Even a simple golem used for menial tasks could take several months to create. This entire city of golems. Oh, right. He's supposed to have lived for several thousand years, after all. All right, let's hold off any more questions for now, Miza said, rising from his seat. I'm going to check on our roast lamb. As his words trailed off, his expression suddenly stiffened, and his gaze involuntarily drifted toward the direction of the city gate. Mr. Miza, what's wrong? Calidora noticed Miza's odd behavior. However, the latter quickly returned to his normal self, displaying his usual demeanor. It's nothing, just an issue with one of my golems, don't worry, he said, smiling. By the way, my roast lamb is quite exceptional. You ladies will definitely love it once you try it. With that, he hurried out of the room, leaving Calidora and Giranini to exchange puzzled looks. Meanwhile, outside the city gates, a brawny warrior clad in an orange cloak roared furiously as he swung his great axe toward the stone guard. However, faced with this charge, the stone sentinel merely lifted its right hand to parry the blow. A sharp clang resonated, and the heavy axe shattered into a cloud of metal fragments. In the next moment, at a speed nearly invisible to the naked eye, the stone sentinel grasped the warrior's head. Accompanied by a gruesome crunch, the warrior's head was crushed like a watermelon, his blood and brains splattering all over the stone sentinel, adding a layer of horror to its otherwise stoic and simple appearance. Further ahead, several other orange cloak beings were engaged in battle with more stone sentinels. A sturdy shield turned into dust. With just one punch, a cloaked shield guard was pierced through the chest. Swift crossbow bolts fell like gentle spring rain, barely leaving marks on the stone sentinels. A cloaked archer, intent on attacking, hadn't even reacted when his neck was snapped by a sudden slap to his head. A scout seemed to put on a fierce offense, his curved blade whirling rapidly as he hacked at the stone sentinel, but each strike only left a white scratch on the hard surface. In contrast, a single swing of the guardian's fist was all it took to pulverize the cloaked scout, blade and all. As for the warriors were long dead. They thought themselves adept at close combat, but clearly, their opponents this time were far superior. Once the vanguard was lost, a mage who hadn't completed his incantation was brutally torn in half by a stone sentinel. Once the protective shell of a cleric was shattered, he, too, was smashed into a bloody pulp. In less than 3 minutes, an entire standard cloaked squad was annihilated by the iron fists of a few stone sentinels. At that time, Miza appeared at the city gate. Glancing at the mangled heaps of pounded flesh, he frowned. Damn, what the hell are these things that look like people but aren't? The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 21, Air Quality. Luigi and the others had been traversing in the desert for a full week already. During this week, besides dry yellow sand, the only other thing they saw were 2 seaberry trees. Speaking of seaberries, Luigi didn't understand why Yane insisted that he eat some. His tongue nearly fell off from the extreme tartness of those small fruits. He wanted to spit it out, but seeing Yane and Osar grimly swallowing, Luigi felt embarrassed to do otherwise and reluctantly gulped it down despite the sourness. And this was despite him not feeling hungry at all. It was bizarre. Despite his stomach being empty all the time, Luigi hadn't felt a pang of hunger all week. This made him even more convinced that his hair contained chlorophyll. While he wasn't hungry, thirst was a common plight for him and the others. Yane rationed their water with extreme frugality. Each person could only sip a few mouthfuls at designated times each day. Luigi tried to keep the water in his mouth as long as possible to keep his mouth moist, but truthfully, it was a challenge. The scarcity of water nearly compelled him to swallow the precious liquid for brief relief at every moment. Sometimes, Luigi thought perhaps he should have stayed at the camp, waiting for them. Their supplies depended almost entirely on the magical space Yane maintained. If they had one less mouth to feed, they might even have had a surplus. Whenever Luigi harbored such thoughts, he felt an added pressure. I must find a way to be useful, he resolved. Though, while he had such thoughts, Luigi didn't expect an opportunity to arise. After all, this accursed desert was just that, a barren wasteland with nothing. But unexpectedly, just a day after he had this notion, an opportunity arrived. It was at that moment Luigi realized that he had been mistaken. The name, Desert of Burials, wasn't just for show. Under a crimson, blood moon, countless skeletal beasts slowly rose from the sands, howling silently at the sky, revealing the true origins of the desert's name. As soon as Yane realized this, she started chanting an incantation. By the time Luigi caught on, a thick wall of earth had already enveloped their party. Everyone, get ready. Yane casually cast a daylight spell overhead, illuminating the entire earthen shelter. The desert air is basically arid already, so we won't be able to hide for long. Damn it, why is there a blood moon again? I distinctly remember it wasn't due for a few more days, Osar muttered as he adjusted his gear. Probably because we slaughtered that scouting squad near the desert's edge. Fresh blood makes the blood moon rise earlier, remember? Mervyn said while checking on his own equipment. Nonsense, the blood of a few can't be enough to advance the blood moon by several days, Osar said, frowning. Could it be that others have ventured into the desert? Hard to say, you know how it is out there. Mervyn secured his pack, tightened his clothing, and rested his hand on the hilt of his sword, ready to move at a moment's notice. Luigi felt somehow confused watching everyone gear up as if about to face a great enemy. He knew that the situation outside wasn't good, but since they were already sheltered, why would they need to go out? He also noticed the strange moon in the sky and guessed that the circumstances outside was related to it. Since it was the moon, he reasoned that it would disappear with the coming of the day. Couldn't they just wait here until everything outside returned to normal before leaving? The magic lamp cast seems rather interesting. I feel warm and comfortable when it's shining on me. Seeing Luigi seemingly in a daze, Yang quickly nudged him, using gestures and simple words to remind him to get ready for battle. Luigi understood, but what preparations was he supposed to make? Perhaps he ought to take off his clothes to avoid ripping them when he transformed into a bear. But it's such a public place. Luigi glanced at Yang, and then the two others, scratching his cheek. After much deliberation, he finally came to a decision. Take it off. Clothing was a scarce resource in the wilderness, and losing a piece meant having one less. Even if it was to be in full view of everyone, Luigi could no longer care about modesty when they were at such a critical moment. Having made his decision, Luigi gritted his teeth, stamped his foot, turned around, and under the stupefied stares of the other three, disrobed. Then, Luigi displayed what was probably the fastest hand speed of his life. Akin to wrapping a towel, he wrapped the robe around his waist, covering his rear that was illuminated by magically created light. This way, when he expanded into a bear, the clothing would naturally be stretched open and fall off rather than being torn apart. Watching Luigi's splendid movements, Osar inhaled sharply. Yang, did you tell him that those clothes can be easily made by your familiars as long as you have the right kind of plants? Yang's mouth twitched. Given his current level of spell understanding, I still don't know how to explain it to him. Mervyn eyed Luigi expressionlessly, saying nothing. And suddenly, someone let out a snicker. Yang and Osar both turned to look at Mervyn, but the latter was still stoic and silent. Seeing the reactions of the other three, Luigi had no idea what expression was showing on his own face right now. He only knew that it must be an extremely awkward one. All right, it seems we are all prepared. Osar couldn't stand it any longer and changed the subject. Yang, how's the air quality now? How much longer can we stay hidden? Let me check, Yang responded, chanting for a second, then said, currently, air quality is great, enough for. What the heck, great, why? This reaction wasn't limited to Yang. Osar and Mervyn were equally stunned. Great air quality? What the hell, this is the desert of burials. The air outside could only be described as average, and with 4 living beings huddled up in this small enclosed space for so long, how could the air quality have improved? Yang, are you sure you checked right? Mervyn asked. This doesn't make any sense even magically. No, it makes too much sense. Yang's gaze was fixed on Luigi, making the latter feel uneasy, not knowing whether to turn his back or cover his chest. You guys might not believe it, Yang continued, seemingly oblivious to Luigi's panic, but this guy's breathing seems to purify the air. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Published by Ranobes. Chapter 22, Turtling Like a Turtle. In the ancient desert city, Giranini and Calidora were seated on a terrace, enjoying shaved ice. Unwittingly, they had been staying in the city for a week already. Initially, they planned to explore the city to find a direction out of the desert, but under Miza's hospital care, their stay was prolonged. It wasn't that they weren't anxious to leave, it was just that such matters couldn't be rushed. After wandering in the desert for 2 months, they were both physically and mentally exhausted. It was way too easy to lose track of time after finally finding a place to rest and enjoy some shaved ice. If it weren't for Calidora's constant thoughts of Mervyn and their companions, she felt that she could, like the others who had chanced upon this place, be content to stay for a lifetime, never wanting to venture into the desert again. As for Giranini, well, in a sense, the two were rather similar, but compared to the skeletal creatures that only appeared during the blood moon, these orange capes were more troublesome. Giranini wasn't a capricious person, that Calidora knew. If one day, Calidora told her to leave, she would follow without a single complaint. But if Calidora never said so, she would just be like this, contentedly having her shaved ice and would probably not speak up regardless of how many days passed. This was trust and understanding, but at the same time, it was also pressure. Gazing up at the sky, Calidora sighed. Then, she suddenly felt that something amiss. Strange, where is the moon tonight? Calidora wondered. Moon? Giranini craned her neck, then looked all around before exclaiming, Really, where did the moon go? There aren't even any clouds in the sky. Strange, speaking of which, have we seen it at all these few days? Calidora said, rubbing her temples. I haven't been paying attention and can't remember. That's quite coincidental, Giranini mused. I haven't been paying attention either. Calidora stroked her chin, recalling the strange barrier she had sensed within the city, and a guess came to her head. Could that barrier be used to block the moonlight? Light was required to see things, after all. If the moonlight here was blocked, then naturally, the moon wouldn't be visible here. Let's wait and see what happens tomorrow, Calidora decided. If it's still missing, perhaps we can ask Mr. Miza. Miza stood alone at the gates of the ancient city, hands behind his back, surveying the sprawling desert before him. The crescent moon above was blood red, casting a chilling, crimson hue over his pale skin. In front of him, several dozen soldiers in orange cloaks battled fiercely against countless skeletal beasts in the desert. They cooperated with each other, adeptly dismembering beast after beast. It was evident they were experienced in combating these skeletal creatures, a skill honed from wandering the desert for an indeterminate amount of time. If they hadn't mastered handling common threats that emerged during the blood moon, they would have perished here long ago. Miza was in deep contemplation while watching their battle. These beings unnerved him greatly. He had never before encountered beings whose eyes burned with such intense zeal. Not even the most fanatical cults displayed such pure frenzy. These troubling entities seemed indifferent to their own injuries or the deaths of their companions. Each one was just focused on relentlessly assaulting the surrounding beasts. Well, in a sense, the two were rather similar, but compared to the skeletal creatures that only appeared during the blood moon, these orange capes were more troublesome. Since the first group perished outside the city a week ago, this was the third occurrence of such entities appearing outside the city walls. There were 2 squads during the previous occurrence, which was 4 days after the first incident. This time, 3 days later, brought about 4 squads. Not only were these beings appearing more and more frequently, their numbers also increased with each time. This wasn't a good sign. Miza couldn't determine the origins of these beings but had a vague sense that they were very dangerous. Yet, he wasn't particularly concerned. For if danger were to be measured, this desert itself was hardly inferior. Time to let them witness the ruthlessness of this desert, Miza muttered. Yet, he didn't chant any incantations, nor did he reach for a weapon. There wasn't even a hint of magical energy fluctuating from his body. He simply took a step forward, and that was all. A sudden change happened in the next instant. The blood moon's glow intensified, and the sky was dyed crimson. The skeletal beasts momentarily froze, and in the next moment, as if driven by desperation, engaged in an even more furious onslaught. Even the dismembered and scattered bones on the ground reassembled skeletal creatures and rejoined the battle. Meanwhile, the earth trembled as something massive was moving slowly beneath the thick layers of sand. Suddenly, a gigantic bone claw, the size of an elephant, slowly emerged from the ground. It slammed violently onto the surface, pulling the rest of its body out of the sand. It was the skeleton of a skeletal dragon towering several dozen meters high. The skeletal dragon raised his head and opened its jaws as if to let out a silent roar toward the blood-stained sky. That's it, then, Miza muttered to himself, turning around to head back into the city. Behind him, the massive skeletal dragon swept down with its claws, instantly tearing through the defenses of these orange capes. Myza didn't need to look back to know the fate that awaited them. This desert never returned the remains of what it devoured. Far away, in the deep sea, broken turtle shells and bits of innards drifted all around, and the water dyed red with blood. Atop a throne carved out of a coral, a middle-aged man in a crimson cape held a turtle man by the neck with one hand. The turtle man wore a gorgeous coat of fish scale, had pearls adorning his neck, and a crown sculpted from diamonds. Unfortunately, no matter how beautiful these decorations were, they only added to the sense of desolation when paired with his face full of despair. Turtle, you people really know how to hide in your shells. Despite being underwater, the middle-aged man's voice clearly echoed around. For 2 centuries, you've been dodging and hiding with the ocean currents, wasting 200 years of my time. And yet, what's the result? You all still end up as nothing but mud. The turtle man struggled, generating countless incisive water currents faster than the speed of sound to continuously barrage the man before him. However, the man's right hand was immovable as if cast from steel. He was completely indifferent to the turtle man's attacks. Ah, to be honest, I actually wanted to spare your life, the man said with a smile. I've always wanted a pet, but cats and dogs, they die in just over a decade. So I thought, a sea turtle like you would be more suitable as my pet. What do you say? Would you consider it, leaving the last of your inferior race as a keepsake? The turtle man's eyes reddened upon hearing this, and he furiously swung his fists, pummeling the man's face relentlessly. Unfortunately, he couldn't inflict any damage. Ha, goodness, it seems you were a fool after all, the man sighed, exerting some strength in his arm, and with a single squeeze, he crushed the turtle man's neck and spine until it was no thicker than a twig. Then, he let go. With rage and despair still etched on his face, the turtle man's corpse sank into the dark depths of the ocean. Afterward, the man turned his head, looking in a certain direction. 4 squads, adding to the previous, a total of 8 squads have been wiped out, he muttered, then suddenly laughed. Interesting, I knew that there must be something hidden there. Looks like it's time to unveil that mystery. Chapter 23.1. So you were saying, this thing can be eaten? Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. This was probably the most comfortable Blood Moon Knight Yane and her companions had experienced since entering this desert. Despite the ferocity of the skeletal beasts outside, they clearly lacked a brain and didn't care for a mound that suddenly appeared in the desert. Lu Ji sat with his legs crossed in the center of earth and space, still maintaining his bare-chested state. If not for his thick long hair, he would look almost like a revered Buddha figure placed on an altar. To the side, Osar and Mervyn rested against the earthen wall. Opportunities for a good sleep were rare in the desert. While it wasn't absolutely safe right now, they weren't willing to pass up this rare chance to rest. Yane was on watch duty. It wasn't that she didn't want to sleep, but unlike the other two, she had an option for catching up on sleep, in the bamboo basket on Osar's back during the day. For Osar, carrying an extra 40 or so kilograms barely counted as extra weight. As for Lu Ji, having been a potato for so long, he probably no longer had a concept of a biological clock. He could rest at any time and be awake at any time. Sometimes he'd be in a half-asleep state while trudging along. In any case, he wasn't sleepy right now and didn't want to leave Yane to keep watch alone, so he simply decided not to sleep. Noticing Lu Ji staring at her, Yane reached into her magic space to rummage around, then pulled out her notebook. Since they were idle, instead of sitting around doing nothing, it might be better to study properly. At that moment, Lu Ji thought Yane resembled a high school English teacher who took students on a spring field trip, yet not forgetting to make the whole bus recite vocabulary together during the journey. After the first rays of dawn rose, Yane lowered the surrounding earthen walls. By then, calm had returned to the barren desert, with only sand as far as the eye could see. It was as if the monsters that swarmed the dunes the night before had never existed. Yane, who had taught Lu Ji incantations all night, yawned as she took out the stuff from Osar's back basket and stuffed them into her magic space before crawling into the basket. Understanding her intentions, Osar picked up the basket, then glanced at Lu Ji. The latter looked radiant, completely unlike someone who had gone a whole night without sleep. He must have slept too, thought Osar to himself as he turned to Mervyn. Currently, Mervyn was adjusting a dial that had a pointer on the inner circle and a degree scale on the outer circle. After the pointer stopped, the direction it pointed to, left at 74 degrees, was the direction of the faint fluctuation they had sensed before. Once confirming the direction, the three resumed their journey. Since the two had gotten good rest and Yane was in the back basket sleeping, they moved at a much faster pace than before because of Mervyn's anxiousness. At first, Osar worried that Lu Ji might not keep up with their pace, but he noticed the latter seemed to be rather relaxed, falling behind, though with his mind seemingly somewhere else. As for what he was thinking about, last night, Yane, worried that Lu Ji might accidentally misuse a spell in their closed environment, only taught him some incantations related to water magic, which was virtually ineffective in this arid desert. Of course, as usual, they were all single words that couldn't be used directly. But at this time, Lu Ji felt that he ought to try it out. For example, the incantation word for water element, combined with the word for condense, along with the proprietary preposition for spells, should constitute the most basic water element condensation spell. After all, the spell to release fire element had been formatted this way. Let's try it, Lu Ji thought to himself, pointing his right index finger into the air and reciting the incantations he had imagined. Immediately, Lu Ji felt a certain power within him being successfully invoked, and something in the air responded to his call. A strange fluctuation coalesced in his hand, and the next moment, he succeeded. His finger was wet. Lu Ji licked it. It tasted a little salty. Lu Ji wondered if it might have just been his sweat. No, this wasn't important. He had seen Ying store so much water before they left, which confirmed that this spell wasn't effective in the desert. But it was very strange. Although the desert air was dry, the amount of water in the air should still be at least half, or perhaps a thought of what it is in normal areas. Even if our campsite was humid, even if the humidity was 3 times, no, 5 times, or 10 times, the difference in the same magic shouldn't be that vast, should it? Could it be that water element doesn't refer to the vapor in the air? Or is there actually something specifically called water element? Since this is a matter of magic, scientific reasoning can't always be applied. So, if there really is something known as water element, then can this thing be eaten? What, you're leaving? Myza looked across the dining table in surprise at the two ladies. That is rather unexpected. I hope it's not because my hospitality has been lacking. Of course not, your hospitality has been nothing more than generous, Calidora replied earnestly. The original reason we approached the city was to determine the direction across the desert. We've stayed long enough, and I fear if we stay any longer, I truly won't have the courage to venture back out into the desert. It sounds like you must have a pressing reason to leave. Myza sat up straighter. Could you tell me about it? Perhaps I might be able to help. Thank you for your offer, but it really isn't something that others can really assist with, Calidora said. Besides us too, many of our comrades entered this desert as well, but due to some mishaps, we got separated. We need to reach the other end of the desert and search for them. Oh, I'm sorry to say this, but have you considered that they might not have been as fortunate as you two? Myza fiddled with his fingers. No, Mr. Myza, if surviving wasn't down to just luck. Calidora shook her head slightly. You should know that before arriving at your city, we had already survived in this desert for 2 months. Our companions are equally capable as well. That's a good point. Myza rubbed his forehead. A good point indeed. But not good enough. After all, for a certain reason, last night's blood moon might have been on a different scale compared to previous ones. But Myza found it hard to voice out regarding this matter. If Calidora's companions hadn't managed to leave the desert yet, they might have perished last night. So, Mr. Myza, can you point us to the end of the desert? We are very grateful for your hospitality these past days, and as a token of our thanks, perhaps we could give you something from outside, Calidora said. No, I don't really desire anything. Misa shook his head slightly. But I have to say, perhaps you still don't fully understand this desert. Truth be told, when in your presence, no one else can truly claim to understand this desert, said Calidora frankly. But we still need to leave. Our companions are waiting for us. No, you don't understand what I mean. Misa sighed. I think, since you ladies spent 2 months in the desert, you must have experienced a blood moon, right? Ah, yes, of course. Calidora nodded, but we had our ways to cope with it. No, you were mistaken. Misa shook his head. What I meant to say is, that isn't a real blood moon. Calidora froze. Not a real blood moon? Is there a fake blood moon? In all the legends, hasn't the desert of Burial's blood moon been the same for thousands of years? Calidora looked toward Giranini. Clearly, the usually quiet Lalafell couldn't offer any valuable advice now. She just shrugged helplessly. Seeing their baffled expressions, Misa stroked his chin and sighed. Well then, you'll see for yourselves tonight. See what? Calidora was puzzled. You'll understand when the time comes, Misa said with a slight smile. By then, I believe you ladies will come to a new understanding of this desert. Chapter 23.2. So you were saying, this thing can be eaten? Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Incantations were fascinating. As mentioned, by continuously reciting the same word and constantly refining the subsequent idea, one could deepen their understanding of an incantation. Initially, this process was quick. Mastering the pronunciation allowed one to grasp the basic meaning. However, to understand the deeper layers, relying solely on recitation slowed down the rate of information acquisition. Lu Ji vaguely felt that there must be more efficient ways to learn. Unfortunately, he didn't know them yet, and Yang probably wouldn't teach him these methods until he had a clear grasp of basic vocabulary. So, if he wanted to delve deeper now, he could only use the most basic method, which was to keep repeating the word. To explore whether water elements were edible, Lu Ji had been mentally repeating the incantation word, water element, all day, averaging 30 times a minute. At present, the sun was already setting, and Lu Ji didn't know how many times he had repeated it in total. In any case, he would just keep reciting. At least now, he had gained a rough understanding about the basic properties of the water element. The so-called magical elements were indeed not the same as physical substances. These magical elements seemed more like spirits that could manipulate certain substances. They were formless and omnipresent, and the essence of incantations was actually the language used to communicate with them. And they were the basis on which magic could be successfully cast. Magic energy was like a form of compensation required to engage them. Of course, this was the most superficial means of understanding. Deeper logic was much more complex. And of course, for Lu Ji, this simple understanding was more than sufficient. At least he now understood many things. For instance, why utilizing water magic in the desert was so difficult despite the presence of significant moisture in the air. This was because elemental spirits always chose environments that were more suitable for their existence. In areas like deserts, water elements were almost non-existent. Using water magic in such regions was like trying to hail a cab when deep inside a forest. Even if a high price was offered and the search area expanded, the best one might get was a second-hand tractor even if waiting for a long time. Then, Lu Ji also realized that his idea of consuming water elements raw wasn't very practical. After all, these elements were intangible, making it impossible to physically consume them. However, that didn't mean that there was no way to consume them. Lu Ji vaguely sensed that elemental spirits might indeed have a means of appearing in physical form. As for how to achieve it, he'd probably have to ask Yang. Just that he didn't know when there might be another chance for an extra one-on-one lesson like last night. Crap, when did I become so keen on learning? Just as Lu Ji's mind was wandering with these thoughts, he accidentally bumped into the bamboo basket on Osar's back. Looking up, Lu Ji saw that the two had stopped for some reason and were gazing toward the end of the horizon. Lu Ji followed the direction of their gazes and saw a blood-red crescent moon slowly rising. Tonight was a blood moon, too. Outside the ancient city, Misa withdrew his right foot that had just stepped out. Watching the slowly rising blood moon, he sighed softly. Then, he turned toward the city gates, where several dozen Cape fighters were engaged in a fierce combat with the stone sentinels. That's right, these mysterious bunch of Cape beings had come again today, and their numbers had even increased. Although the stone sentinels were powerful, they also appeared overwhelmed facing an assault nearly 10 times their number. But Misa didn't care at all. The number of these foes didn't matter to him. This desert had a vast appetite. No matter if they came by the tens, hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands, they would all be consumed by this land, leaving behind no remains. What Misa was curious about was how these beings had survived the previous night's blood moon. Or maybe, they hadn't even been in this desert the previous night. Perhaps they had some means of coming here quickly from somewhere else. But whatever the case, Misa didn't care. Since they liked throwing their lives away, he would let them come all they want. He had been bored for too many years anyway. Some things could add a bit of color to his tranquil life, and he was more than happy. As Misa stepped back into the city gate, a swirl of sand arose from nowhere, blowing all the cloaked figures out, and the few stone sentinels quickly took the opportunity to rush back inside the city gate. Following that, the massive and thick stone door thunderously shut, completely sealing the entrance. At the same time, the last ray of sunlight on the horizon also vanished, and half of the blood moon was now visible. The earth began to tremble as countless skeletal beasts emerged from the ground, continuing their frenzy from the previous night. Misa looked up at the city walls, where Calidora and Giranini stood. Take a good look. This is just a glimpse of the true face of this land, Misa murmured. I just wonder whether you will still have the courage to face this desert again after witnessing such a scene. Chapter 24. We aren't alone in the path of illiteracy. Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. Dark wings cut through the sky, and with a terrifying surge, a skeletal dragon swooped down, its claws striking the ground and splitting it apart. Skeletal giants silently roared to the heavens, their heavy fists pounding down and sending waves of sand hundreds of meters across. Deformed bone beasts continuously surged from beneath the earth, swarming and endless. Under this blood moon frenzy, the dozens of cloaked figures appeared as fragile as leaves in a storm, utterly powerless. They managed to hold on for only a few minutes before completely engulfed by the wave of skeletal creatures. Misa, arms crossed, leaned against the city wall, observing Calidora and Giranini's reactions. In their eyes, he saw fear and panic. This wasn't surprising. In fact, many of Misa's previous friends had also had the chance to witness blood moons of this magnitude, and their expressions were largely similar to those of the two ladies. After the last cloaked figure was utterly torn apart, Misa walked up behind the two. I won't stop you from leaving, but, Misa posed his question, after seeing such a scene, is your decision still the same as before? He had asked this same question to a few friends of his that had wanted to leave in the past. Afterward, he almost always received the same answer. So, when he asked this question, he was actually expecting them to give the answer he had imagined. He even thought that perhaps later, he could send a few golems out to help them find their companions and bring them here. He didn't mind having more people. More people meant more liveliness. As for whether their companions would want to stay here, having been driven to enter this desert against their will, they surely had no reason to complain about the environment here. However, Calidora's first words after turning around were, Mr. Misa, I'm afraid we need to leave now, as soon as possible, and you must come with us. This utterly unexpected statement left Misa choking on his prepared words, and he was stunned for a long moment, only to finally utter a confused, huh? Seeing Misa's baffled expression, Calidora quickly explained, You've been in the desert for too long, Mr. Misa. Perhaps you're unaware of what those cloaked figures represent. You mean those not quite human things? Misa frowned slightly. Do you know their origin? Yes, they are the very reason we want to flee to the other side of the desert. Calidora nodded. They are the minions of a tyrant, an army from another world. I never imagined that we would actually see 2 blood moon nights in a row, muttered Osar while eating some grilled bear meat. We paid those Earth-dwellers a lot, and they didn't even warn us about this. Maybe they forgot, or maybe they didn't know either, Mervyn, leaning against the Earth wall and caressing his disc, replied. After all, even Yang hadn't heard of such a thing. Thankfully, we have this guy, Osar said, patting Lu Ji on the back with a grin. Otherwise, we would have been in real bad shape after these 2 nights. Lu Ji didn't understand what Osar was saying and glanced at the latter in puzzlement. The smiling Osar just gave him a big thumbs up. Lu Ji, still confused, didn't know how to react but eventually returned the gesture along with a smile. Under the light of the daylight spell, his smile seemed especially brilliant. Then, he turned back to Yang and continued gesturing. Lu Ji still hadn't given up on his idea of trying some water elemental sashimi, although it was a complex concept to convey through gestures alone, and Yang hadn't quite grasped what he was trying to say. But, speaking of which, Osar turned back to Mervyn. We have a means to sleep through these 2 days, but Callie and the others. I'm a bit worried. Yeah, if Shello or Enwardo were there, it might still be alright, but... Mervyn sighed deeply. Before we were swept away by the current, I vaguely saw that only Giranini was with Callie. If it's just the 2 of them, no, they're both very capable. They must be fine, Osar said, forcing a smile and gently punching Mervyn's shoulder. Calidora is one of the best holy dragon mages, and Giranini, don't be fooled by her size, she can be way stronger than me when she gets serious. Ha, I know that. Mervyn leaned back against the wall. You're just trying to comfort me while you're worried yourself. Is it that obvious? Osar rubbed his nose sheepishly. It doesn't matter what you show. I know how you are as a person. Mervyn shrugged. Maybe. Osar bit into the bare meat. I just want us all to get together again, like before, to eat and drink together. Oh, and we should include our new friend, too. Even though we don't speak the same language, I think the others will like him. Hey, if he learns incantation, the only ones left who don't understand might just be the 2 of us. Mervyn grimaced. If I recall correctly, even Giranini knows some simple incantation. No, at least Wowo doesn't either. Believe me, we aren't alone in the path of illiteracy, said Osar. She doesn't? Mervyn was astonished. Then, how does she enchant her arrows? By rigorous memorization. Osar shrugged. Her talent for magic is really poor, and she can't grasp the meanings of the spells no matter how much she tries. Normally, a person would understand the basic meaning after repeating the spell a few dozen times, but she can't get it even after hundreds of repetitions. Even if you tell her the meaning directly, she still gets confused. Eventually, her teacher gave up and had her memorize all the enchantment spells for her arrows, telling her to just recite them from muscle memory. I see, I guess that's why she gets those spells mixed up sometimes, huh? Mervyn massaged his temples. That explains the time she tried to cast a flaming shield but ended up firing a barrage of oil arrows instead, causing the shield to explode. I was nearly blown up then. So that's why she avoided you for a period. It was because she blasted your face full of soot, huh? Osar guffawed. I remember she wouldn't talk to you at all during that time and only just nodded or shook her head. Hey, as if she speaks much usually. Mervyn waved dismissively. She just nods or shakes her head when she meets strangers anyway. Chapter 25. Staying at home for too long does that to a person. Published by Ranobes. The hero turned into a potato and the world fell to ruin. While Osar and Mervyn were talking about their companions, Lu Ji finally managed to get his idea across to Yang. Yang was silent for some time, then wrote down a string of somewhat complex incantations in her notebook. Syllable by syllable, she then taught Lu Ji how to pronounce it. This spell was quite a mouthful, with many syllables sounding like a mix of several simple tones pronounced simultaneously. After several unsuccessful attempts, Lu Ji quickly realized that to fluently pronounce these syllables, he would need to be very familiar with the basic single tone spells related to water elements. Fortunately, the single tones he had learned the previous night, although a bit rough, seemed sufficient. With some extra time and effort, he was eventually able to correctly pronounce the incantation. After repeating the spell 2 or 3 times, the basic meaning of the spell became clear in Lu Ji's mind: pure water element aggregate. After repeating it a few dozen more times, Lu Ji began to understand the concept. Some more complex magical operations required the cooperation of multiple mages, but some powerful mages could perform such spells alone by first conjuring a pure aggregate of the element, then proceeding with the spellcasting. In such cases, the aggregate had both the physical properties of the element and the characteristics of an elemental spirit. Lu Ji wasn't sure about other elements like fire or lightning, as they seemed too dangerous to handle, but he figured that in this state, water elements could indeed be consumed, or at least drunk. Once he was sure of this, Lu Ji excitedly communicated to Yang his strong desire to see her summon a pure water element aggregate for him to examine. Though puzzled, Yang, considering herself a teacher, could not refuse what seemed like a reasonable request from a student eager to broaden his horizons. Thus, via vague gestures, she told Lu Ji that if they encountered a seaberry tree tomorrow, she could give it a try. After all, in this desert, it was only in areas where seaberry trees could grow that water elementals might exist. As for now, Yang flipped open the lesson plan she had prepared for today. She had spent the entire day in Osar's back basket, and evidently, she hadn't spent the whole time sleeping. Seeing the densely packed topics for today's lesson, Lu Ji felt a tingling in his scalp. Looks like tonight would be even more packed than yesterday. In the main hall of the ancient desert city, Misa sat in his chair, rhythmically tapping the armrest with his fingers. Just as Calidora had said, he had been in the desert for far too long. So long that the world outside had changed dramatically, and he knew nothing about it. Ifrit Realm, Icy Peak Mountain, Kamos City, even Dragon City high above the Cloud Sea. All of these were destroyed decades ago. Misa rubbed his forehead. What about the Jade Coral Palace in the deep sea? It has long been abandoned. The Jade Turtle race has been wandering in the deep sea for over 200 years, their population continually decreasing as they are relentlessly pursued by the tyrant. Calidora shook her head. Before we came here, it seemed like there were only a few 100,000 left. A few 100,000, they were once a billion-strong race. Misa unconsciously shut his eyes. Damn it. A few 100,000 left isn't bad at all. Everyone else on the continent has already been nearly exterminated by the tyrant. Giranini, sprawled on the table, prattled. When the major races united to oppose him, they were massacred so badly that their survivors weren't even in the tens of thousands. Those bastards refused to join the alliance, thinking these were just matters of our land and they'd be safe hiding in the sea. Well, hey. Nini, they are victims too. Calidora prodded Giranini's face. The ones we should resent aren't them. I know, I'm just angry, Giranini muttered. If they had joined the fight back then, perhaps we might have won. Oh, and those dwarves too, they are all cowards. Calidora stroked Giranini's hair, but didn't say anything. Because when it came to specifics, her own race reckoned they could stay out of the conflict several hundred years ago, while Giranini's Miffy race was among the first to join the fight. Surely she harbored resentment toward the Dragonblood race, but she refrained from saying it out of consideration for Calidora. As a race that was among the first to resist the tyrant, the Miffys suffered horribly under the tyrant's targeting. Giranini could be said to have lived her entire life in fear, while Calidora and Mervyn at least had a relatively peaceful childhood in Dragon City. Giranini didn't even have a place she could call home. So now, are there any races left on this side of the desert that haven't been struck down? Misa asked. No, every race is basically struggling on the verge of extinction. Calidora sighed. Maybe the Wood Elves are the only ones slightly better off. Although the Great Forest was set on fire, quite a bit of them survived. But conversely, they might be the most miserable, Giranini muttered. Now they hardly ever move at all, usually maintaining a plant form. Filling the entire forest with flowers like before is a pipe dream, for they don't even dare to grow leaves now. The Great Forest once known as the Forest of Dreams is now just a dead land filled with dead trees. Misa just listened silently, stroking his chin in contemplation. Calidora waited a while, glancing at Giranini before she turned to Misa and asked, Mr. Misa, do you think we should prepare early, collect the golems, and leave this place before the tyrant sends more minions over? No, Misa shook his head. I'm sorry, I don't wish to leave. You don't wish to leave? Calidora was taken aback. Why? Well, how should I put it? Maiza sighed deeply. Let's say, have you ever done a jigsaw puzzle? If you spent nearly a lifetime completing a whole jigsaw puzzle, and then someone tells you that a jerk came out of nowhere and smashed your lifetime's work to pieces, would you forgive him? I think I'd probably kill him, Giranini muttered. Ha, coincidentally, that's what I reckon too. Maiza chuckled. So, I don't wish to leave, and besides, honestly speaking, I can't leave even if I wanted to. As he spoke, Maiza stood up, walked to the door before turning his head back and saying, oh right, if you don't want to die, I suggest you also don't leave this city for the time being. Because for the next while, this desert will be more than you can handle.